Bonnie was an 18-year-old college student who was last seen making her way to the bus stop one September morning in 1994. However, she never showed up to her class, and she didn't make it home that night. It wasn't until 3 a.m. that her mother got the news. The police had found Bonnie, and it wasn't good. This is her story. We're talking about Bonnie Christine Craig. She was born in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, on March 30th, 1976, to her parents, Karen and Gordon Craig. Even before Bonnie was born, her mother loved her so much and was anxiously awaiting her arrival. Bonnie's mother, Karen, met her father, Gordon, while they were in high school. She got pregnant at 17 with Bonnie's older brother, Jason. She and Gordon got married in July of 1973, and then 3 years later, they had Bonnie. She was her parents' first daughter and the first granddaughter to her grandparents. Everyone was so excited to welcome a baby girl into the family. By the time Bonnie was 3 years old, Karen had split from her father, and unfortunately, he hadn't been a big part of Bonnie's life. Karen had met someone special who cared about her and her kids. His name was Gary Campbell. It wasn't long before Karen and Gary tied the knot, and by the time Bonnie was 5, the couple welcomed a son into the world, whom they named Adam. Thrilled to have a younger brother, Bonnie called him her real-life Cabbage Patch doll. Just 1 year later, Karen and Gary welcomed another baby, Samantha, and Bonnie's life became even more joyful. Bonnie could dress up her baby sister in princess gowns and jewelry, something that Adam certainly wouldn't let her do. As Samantha grew up, she wanted to be just like her big sister Bonnie, who was 6 years older. Bonnie was also such a cutie pie, with big blue eyes and freckles across her nose. Plus, she excelled in everything she set out to do, especially in academics. It wasn't until Samantha was in 3rd grade that she finally figured out Bonnie was her half-sister. She had always thought they had the same parents, and this discovery tore her apart. If anyone tried to point out the fact that Bonnie was Samantha's half-sister and not her full sister, she would reply that she didn't know what they were talking about. As a big sister to Adam and Samantha, Bonnie loved looking after them, and she treated them like they were her own children. She was their stability, as their world changed quite often, more than most kids. Their new blended family moved a lot for Gary's job as he worked for BP Oil Company. Over the years, Bonnie attended 6 elementary schools, 2 junior high schools, and 1 high school. One thing she became good at was accepting change and learning to fit in with new people quickly. First, the family moved from Calgary, Alberta, to San Francisco, where they lived in the East Bay area. Bonnie and her siblings were thrilled because they had a pool and a huge backyard at that point. Following their relocation to California, the family soon traded sunshine and pools for snow and ice skating in Anchorage, Alaska. Now, this may not be paradise to everyone, but Alaska appealed to the kids even more than California with its constant sunshine. There was just so much to do against the beautiful scenic Alaskan backdrop. However, they wouldn't get to enjoy it for long. Soon, Gary's career took them from Alaska to West Texas, back to the lower 48. While Bonnie wasn't as happy in Texas as she had been in Alaska or California, they lived in a neighborhood with plenty of activities for her and her siblings, and they enjoyed it as best they could. Initially, the family lived in Midland, Texas, for 2 years before they moved to Houston, where they stayed in a community called Sugarland for a few months. But it wasn't long before Bonnie's family packed up their things once again to move. When the kids were asked by Karen and Gary where they would want to live if they could choose anywhere in the world, all 3 answered Anchorage, Alaska, without hesitation. So, back to Alaska it was, and everyone was happy to be heading back to the place they considered home. Following their return, Bonnie was in junior high school, but soon another big change came. Karen and Gary decided to get a divorce, which was very hard on all the kids. Bonnie saw Gary as her father, and now Samantha and Adam were alternating weeks between their parents. 1 week with Gary and 1 with Karen, meaning Bonnie saw less of them. Nonetheless, she remained close to her stepdad. After junior high, Bonnie attended Service High School, where she excelled academically. She was active in sports, music, and many other clubs and organizations, both at school and in the community. Besides coaching the swim and diving teams, she enjoyed horseback riding, writing poetry, playing the violin and viola in the school orchestra, and she was even the first girl to join the service high school wrestling team. Her goal was to never get pinned. But something very traumatic was going to happen. Another change in Bonnie's life, one more permanent than most. Her dear friend Katie Garcia died in a drunk driving accident. This tragedy changed Bonnie's life forever and may have had a significant impact on her future in an unexpected way. After Katie's death, Bonnie made two vows. She would never drink a drop of alcohol, and she wouldn't get behind the wheel of a car. She refused to drive, walking everywhere or taking the bus instead. She didn't even bother to get her driver's license, as the fear was much too intense. Bonnie even founded a chapter of Students Against Drunk Driving at her school. She was truly an incredible person with a heart for other people. And there was someone who had her heart too. Her boyfriend, Cameron Miyazaki. He was a year ahead of her, and they met while he was in his senior year. They were smitten, and you could tell they were made for one another. Bonnie even posed with him in his senior pictures, and they were adorable. Soon, however, another change came. Cameron graduated before Bonnie and moved to California to study architecture at the University of California, Berkeley. Though his leaving was inevitable, it was still a loss for Bonnie, though temporary, as they remained in a long-distance relationship. They talked multiple times a day, either by phone or email. After graduating from high school, Bonnie enrolled at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. She wanted to become a psychologist, and things were just beginning to come together for her, even though so much had already come to an end. At this point, Bonnie had decided it was time to move out of her mother's house. Things had gotten a little cramped. Her mother had started dating a man named Jim Foster a couple of years before, and he had 3 kids of his own, ranging in age from 8 to 13. Karen still had her 3 younger children living with her, and her oldest, Jason, was 20 and lived with his girlfriend in his own apartment. Bonnie thought it was time to have her own space and be a little more independent, so she asked if she could live with her stepdad, Gary. That way, she still got to see her younger siblings, Adam and Samantha, whenever they came to their dad's house every other week. Gary's house was only 15 minutes away from her university, so things worked out quite well. The vows Bonnie made after Katie's death required many sacrifices, especially once she started college. Typically, students who attend college go to parties, partake in alcohol, and certainly enjoy getting around in a car, but not Bonnie. She held firm to those promises. She took the public bus to school 3 days a week and walked 2 miles from her stepdad's house in the freezing Alaskan cold just to get to the bus stop for her university. Most of Bonnie's classes were packed into either 2 or 3 days a week because she worked part-time at Sam's Club. This 2-mile pre-dawn walk on a desolate rural road was long and could be a bit scary, especially for someone walking alone. Bonnie was aware that this walk wasn't the safest. She even gave her sister safety tips about walking alone in the dark, one of which was to carry pepper spray. Bonnie always carried a bottle of pepper spray on her long morning walks. But would that be enough if someone confronted her with criminal intent? I want to take you to the morning of September 28th. I want to take you to the morning of September 28th. I want to take you to the morning of September 28th, 1994. 18-year-old Bonnie Craig woke up at 5 a.m. to get ready for her walk to the bus stop as usual. Bonnie always made sure she had enough time to make it to class because she took pride in being punctual. So she set off before sunrise, even though her English class didn't start for another 2 hours at 7 a.m. After leaving her stepdad's house, Bonnie walked 45 minutes to the bus stop where she was supposed to take the bus to the University of Alaska. Or so everyone thought. 9 hours later, another Anchorage University student, Jennifer Broshwing, was snapping photos on a hiking trail in Chugach State Park, which is just south of Anchorage. This park is about 15 miles away from where Bonnie lived, and it's a beautiful park. Just look at it. These are photos from Google Maps, and they don't even do it justice. It's off of Alaska Route 1, and on the other side of the state highway is part of the Gulf of Alaska. Mid-September is actually one of the best times to visit Alaska because the weather is warmer, The days are longer, and the temperatures are cooler but still comfortable, ranging from 60 to 67 degrees. It's a great time to enjoy your surroundings. As this university student was focusing her camera on the scenic view, something caught her eye, something in the water below the 33-foot cliff that didn't look natural. The color stood out first. It was something bright, something blue, which contrasted against the rushing white tips of the water in McHugh Creek. As she zoomed in closer, she had a horrifying revelation. It was a woman. She was lifelessly floating in the shallow part of the water. It was unmistakably a woman. This was before cell phones, and the student didn't know what to do. She immediately ran back to the parking lot, jumped in her car, and drove to a way station, because that was the nearest place she could find to call 911. Because this was a state park, Alaska State Troopers had jurisdiction, and they responded to the location right away. Once on scene, they observed the woman at the bottom of a very high cliff. She was face down and fully clothed. I actually have footage and some still shots of what they were looking at. You can see her at the base of the cliff. One of her arms is outstretched, and she's in a very unusual position, which is an indication of a fall. This isn't an area of the creek that would be easy to get to, unless someone had fallen from that portion of the cliff above, or walked through the creek to get to this exact spot. So what happened? Officers went to the top of the cliff and looked down from that position. It is a hazardous part of the park. Now, there are railings in this exact spot, but back in 1994 there were none. So if you had been hiking there and you slipped, you would fall right to your death. That's what they think happened in this case. But we wouldn't be here today talking about it if that is what actually happened. You can see right here how far down the creek is. The officers believed that this poor woman had been taking in the sights and the sounds of this beautiful park and lost her footing, falling to her death. But who was she, and did anyone hear or see what had happened? Once the medical examiner arrived, they could get closer to the body, and at that point, could tell the injuries that had been sustained and transport her to the medical examiner's office for an official identification. On the scene, officers had already made a preliminary identification through a ring she was wearing, a class ring. They believed that the woman was Bonnie Craig. They needed to contact her family to see if she had made it home that evening. By the time officers were confident that this was Bonnie, it was close to 10 p.m. that night. That's when a knock came on Bonnie's stepdad's door. It was unusual to get a knock that late at night. They were already wondering why Bonnie wasn't home yet. When Adam and Samantha could see it was an officer, they both gathered at the top of the stairs to watch and listen. When Gary shouted, "Oh my God, not Bonnie," and dropped to his knees, they knew that something terrible had happened to their older sister. Samantha prayed that Bonnie would be okay. Maybe she was just in the hospital. She hoped that nothing serious had happened. However, Samantha's uneasy feelings worsened when she saw her dad collapsed in tears right in front of the officers at the front door. The kids had never seen their father cry, and now they had to inform Bonnie's mother of the devastating news. But there was a problem. She was out of town with her boyfriend, Jim. They were all the way in Florida for Jim's brother Ken's wedding. What's worse is that they were on a sailboat, far from a phone. Karen and Jim had left 2 days before, on September 26th, on a red-eye from Anchorage to Tampa, Florida. Then they chartered a 37-foot sailboat in St. Petersburg and made their way up the Gulf Coast to St. Mark's, a very small port town where Jim spent a lot of time growing up. They decided to make a little vacation out of having to fly so far away for a wedding. This was also a chance for Karen to meet Jim's parents for the very first time. They finally got settled in by Wednesday, September 28th, the same day that Bonnie set out towards the bus stop in the early morning darkness. That evening, Karen and Jim met up with Jim's stepmom, Mary, and his father, who's also named Jim, for dinner, as well as Ken and his soon-to-be wife, Valerie. On Karen's side of the world, everything was great. They were laughing, joking, and having a wonderful time. Karen had no idea what terrible fate had befallen her precious Bonnie, and she wouldn't until 3 a.m. That's when there was a knock on the boat's entryway. "Who in the world would be knocking on their boat at this hour?" Karen asked. She heard, "It's Ken, Jim's brother." When she slid open the door panels, she immediately knew that something wasn't right. If the time wasn't enough to indicate that, Karen saw the expression on Ken's face. It said so much without him having to say anything at all. Karen asked, "What is it?" And he managed to get out the words, "It's Bonnie. She was in a hiking accident." Now, we don't know Karen, but I've gotten to know her very well through my research. Karen is a strong, intelligent, headstrong woman who knows her children. The first thing she thinks is that this is ridiculous. Clearly Ken has his wires crossed. Why drive all this way? It's a long drive to come out to their boat, especially to tell her something like this, because if this was a joke, it wasn't funny. One thing's for sure in Karen's mind, this must be a mistake. Ken says he's sorry, and she's still staring at him confused. She said, "Who told you that?" That's when she sees it, a yellow post-it note. Ken's holding it in his hand. He stretches out his arm, trying to show her what's written on the post-it, but she doesn't care. He says, "I'm sorry again," and Karen's getting more and more frustrated. Then he explains that an Alaska state trooper called him and told him to get a message to Karen. On that post-it was the officer's number. He's stretching out his arm, trying to hand the post-it to her. She snatches it out of his hand and says, "Not my Bonnie. How do they know?" He explains he doesn't know anything. All he knows is that Bonnie had been in an accident and they said to have Karen call. There's no phone on their boat, so Karen and Jim have to get dressed and walk to a nearby payphone. Karen can hardly dial the number, she's shaking so hard. So Jim takes the phone, does it for her, and gives the operator the information they've been given. She says she doesn't recognize it, and pretty much tells them, "You know what? I'm kind of snappy right now. It's 11 p.m. Maybe you should just call back in the morning." Well, Karen, already frustrated with a lot of other emotions running through her, isn't in the mood. She grabs the phone and repeats the trooper's information. She basically lets this operator know, in no uncertain terms, that she had just been told that her daughter died in a hiking accident. That definitely changed the operator's tone. Finally, Sergeant Mike Mars comes on the line and says, "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry that I have to tell you this, Miss Campbell. Bonnie's body was found in McHugh Creek. She fell off a cliff. She's dead. I'm so sorry." This is every parent's worst nightmare. It's hard enough navigating parenthood. We worry about our kids from the minute they're conceived, and once they're born, it's even harder. I don't know how many nights I stayed awake, making sure my daughter was still breathing. Our children are our everything. They're a piece of us. If we lose them forever, a piece of us dies with them. But Karen isn't the average parent. This is a woman who worked as an undercover reserve officer for the Anchorage Police Department for the last 3 years. She's tough. Karen has worked on drug-related cases, gone through the police academy, and is well respected. She likes a challenge and is a self-proclaimed adrenaline junkie. She even worked as a reporter at one point. This wasn't her first rodeo, but it was the first time something hit so close to home. Of course, Karen cared just as much as any other parent, but there was something different. She had an investigator's mind. First things first, she wanted Bonnie's case to be handed over to the department she works with, the Anchorage Police Department. They kind of look down on state troopers. I'm sure you know how all of that works, the competition. But it's not just that. From the first time Karen heard the news, she didn't believe it. She understood what they were saying, that Bonnie was dead. But there was no way this was an accident. Karen is close with the guys at the homicide department at the Anchorage Police Department. She wants people on the case who think like her. She needs to get to the bottom of this. Instinctually, Karen's asking a bunch of questions as a parent, but also as an investigator. Who was Bonnie with? Sergeant Morris said no one. Bonnie was out there alone. Karen wants to know how Bonnie got there. For example, she knows, like many others, that Bonnie doesn't drive. Karen is actually starting to become convinced it's not Bonnie at all. This has got to be someone else's child. Besides, they hadn't even officially identified Bonnie yet. That would come later. We know this location was at least 10 to 15 miles away from Gary's house. It doesn't make sense to Karen. She keeps asking questions like, what time did they find her? Morris says it was around 2:30. And Karen has one more reason to believe this is all a big mistake. She knows Bonnie. Bonnie wouldn't miss a class. There's no way. She lets Morris know that Karen wants to know what makes them so sure that this is Bonnie. That's when he explains that her name was on a class ring that she was wearing, and they pulled up her state ID and compared the picture to their Jane Doe. No one had actually identified her in person yet. The police were waiting for Karen to do that. There was one other question that Karen had. She didn't want it to come out of her mouth, but it did, and it came out in a different way than I'm going to relay it to you. She asked if there was any evidence of forced intercourse, and the officer explained no. Bonnie was fully dressed. But we know that's not proof. Just because you're still dressed doesn't mean it didn't happen. Karen asked if they had collected any evidence at the scene, and this is when she gets extremely frustrated. The sergeant says something. There is no evidence it was an accident. There's nothing to collect. Wow. He even added that because they identified her, there wasn't anything else to look for. Really? Well, Karen isn't so sure about that. I wouldn't be either. We have to take into account that officers deal with these situations again and again. Karen may not be the typical parent, but typically speaking, almost every parent wants to believe that there's been a mistake. It's not their child that has died, especially in an accident. There just has to be something more. But in Bonnie's case, there was more. Karen gets on the very first flight that she can back to Alaska, hoping it wasn't Bonnie at the morgue. There were so many things going through Karen's mind, but she still can't shake that none of this makes sense to her. Gary feels the same way when they get a chance to talk. Karen gets to the airport and, with time before her flight, hangs out by the payphone, calling her loved ones to let them know what was going on. But Karen makes another call to a friend, Kara, who's a reporter in the Anchorage area. Karen is connected. She's assembling her army. She used to be a reporter, remember? She has friends. This friend doesn't pick up at the time, so she leaves a message. The entire flight, Karen's hoping that this is all just a mix-up, that it's not Bonnie, that there's a reasonable explanation for all of this. Maybe Bonnie let someone borrow her ring, and she'll apologize and explain what happened. I want you to know that I got a lot of this information as accurately as possible from reading Bonnie's mother's book. But just so you know, this is where all this information is coming from about what was going on behind the scenes that a lot of shows and news articles will not tell you. Once Karen lands, she sees a familiar face, the police chaplain, Burke McQueen. Karen and Jim know him very well, and they give him a hug. He offers his condolences for the accident, but Karen tells him, if it's Bonnie, then it's got to be murder. Karen's got work to do, but first, the hardest part. She needs to go down to the funeral home and identify Bonnie. How awful to go from sunny skies in Florida on a boat to the darkness of having to face with your deceased teenager. But there she was, laying on a gurney with a white sheet on top of her, just like in the movies, except this was real life. They pulled the sheet down from her face. Karen looks, and it's undeniable. It's Bonnie. She's frozen in time, just lifeless, but still Bonnie. Now she has her confirmation. But remember what she said. If it's Bonnie, then it's gotta be murder. That thought only intensified when she goes down to talk to the troopers at the police department. Karen explains it doesn't make sense. Bonnie was on her way to class. Where's her backpack, her books, her pepper spray? There were so many questions. Karen is about to get bombarded with more from reporters. The local news outlets have jumped on this story. A young, beautiful college student found dead in a creek. Karen invites the questions and the attention because remember, this used to be her job. She knows many of these reporters personally, but there's another reason she wants her daughter's story out there. She knows this is no accident, and they have to act fast. The news travels way faster than the troopers lift a finger to do more than call Bonnie's death an accident. Her story is getting traction. It's going through the entire city, and it won't stop there. The next day, Karen, Jim, Gary, Jason, Adam, and Samantha make their way to the funeral home to say goodbye to Bonnie. It's hard seeing a person they once knew to be so full of life, just have that life stolen from them. They're a shell of who they once were. But her siblings wanted a chance to see her one last time, and Karen did too. When she lifted Bonnie's arm to hold it close to her, she noticed something that wasn't right. Her knuckles were bruised and swollen. Karen begins to pull the white sheet down to expose more of Bonnie's body, and what she sees makes her scream for them to go get the state troopers back over there quick. The funeral director was literally waiting to prepare Bonnie's body for the next step in the funeral process, and Karen won't let them. She demands that the troopers come back to take photos because these were clearly defensive wounds. It's hard because she's a grieving mother. Bonnie fell from 30 feet onto rocks in a shallow creek. She's bound to have sustained a number of injuries, right? But Karen won't give up. I imagine that this is a mother's last chance, the only chance to gather as much information as she can, because her daughter will truly be gone forever soon. You must preserve evidence of what her body looked like right then and there. This should have been done right away, but remember, there was no investigation, it was an accident. As much as Karen begs, the troopers don't give in. Time is running out, so she tries something else. She calls her supervisor at APD, but he can't help her either. It's out of their jurisdiction, and they're so sorry. I was so frustrated for Karen because time is ticking by. She's standing in a funeral home, being pressured to make decisions on what coffin to put her daughter in. She doesn't want to risk losing any potential evidence, so she tells the funeral director she wants Bonnie to be put in a cement vault. That way, thinking to the future, Karen would be able to have her body taken back out in the event that someone will listen to her and they can collect more evidence. Talking to the media worked, though maybe not the way Karen intended, or so it seemed at first. Sergeant Morris calls her down to the station and gets right to the point. He says, "Don't talk to the media, stop giving them fuel, stop calling Bonnie's death a murder." But why? She wants to know what difference it makes. That's when he says something interesting. He says it might hamper their investigation. Wait a minute, investigation? Wasn't Bonnie's death an accident? What investigation are they talking about? Karen doesn't know anything about that. So maybe going to the media was the right thing to do. It's true, Morris explains that they're just investigating all angles at that point, but still it's a step in the right direction as far as Karen is concerned. Next, Morris says he wants her, Gary, Adam, and Samantha to give them fingerprints, DNA, and hair samples. But why? Well, they explain it's to eliminate them as suspects. But why the kids? That's what Karen wants to know. Why put them through that? And Morris says this, "Listen, we really want Gary's DNA, but it will look suspicious if we're only collecting his." So now Karen's head is just spinning. First, she's expecting to go to a wedding, a vacation, meeting Jim's family for the first time, relaxing on a boat. There's a knock at the door at 3 a.m., news that her daughter is dead. Then she's begging the police to investigate it as a murder, them refusing, and now this, claiming her ex-husband who raised Bonnie is a suspect. There are so many thoughts running through her head. Could it possibly be because he had just had a very weird conversation with Karen about something Bonnie had supposedly said out of the blue not too long ago about where she wanted to be buried? Maybe a reason that he wanted to ship her body so far. Plus, Gary wasn't even supposed to be home the day Bonnie went missing. That's right, he was on a business trip and he cut it short out of nowhere, coming home the night before. It turns out he was upset with Bonnie for being out past her curfew because she was supposed to be watching the younger children. Could he have been mad enough to cause her harm? Before I go deeper down that rabbit hole, I want to go back because things have been going on with the state troopers. Just by looking at Bonnie's body at the scene, the day she was found, they were able to tell that she had been dead for several hours, which meant she must have been hiking before sunrise. This added to the mystery and suspicion that there might be more to the story. Now, to the cause of death, the medical examiner determined that Bonnie died as a result of drowning. However, she also sustained a number of severe head injuries from the fall off the cliff. But could it have been something else before her lungs filled up with water? Bonnie suffered at the bottom of that cliff for who knows how long. There were definitely missing pieces of the puzzle. For one, getting to the park before the sun came up meant that Bonnie got there soon after she left Gary's. But how? Someone must have picked her up. Could she have taken a bus and skipped class? But why? Troopers did find something at the scene. It might not have seemed suspicious at first, since Bonnie's death was ruled an accident, but a trooper named Robert Beatty got on his hands and knees and discovered a drop of blood the size of an eraser head. It was around 5 to 6 feet away from the edge of the cliff. Blood where it shouldn't be if this was truly an accident. According to Beatty, the drop looked like it fell straight down. This means something happened to Bonnie before she plummeted off the side of that cliff, something that was forceful enough to make her bleed. If this was indeed her blood, however, they found no signs of violence or weapons at McHugh Creek. The investigators involved knew it was going to be difficult to solve this case. They suspected they were dealing with a homicide, but they didn't let the media or the family know. This was a tactic they were using. They figured it must be someone close to Bonnie, maybe even a family member or a boyfriend, someone who would be in the circle of individuals that would get information related to them. So, they refrained from sharing any of that information with anyone. That's why they were upset with Karen for calling it a murder. They thought the killer would assume there was an investigation and would want to lay low. Now that you know what's going on, let's go back to Bonnie's family. Troopers were finally asking them questions to gain insight into what Bonnie was doing the morning of her death and to look into Gary since he was a person of interest. There was something even more suspicious than wanting to ship her body to Canada. Apparently, Gary refused to let Karen remove Bonnie's belongings from his home. He even went so far as to put a lock on Bonnie's door so that not even his own children could go inside. Why? It all started when Gary asked Karen where the framed picture of Bonnie had gone. Karen explained she had given it to the troopers. They needed a picture of her. Gary accused Karen of stealing it and got very defensive about giving the rest of Bonnie's possessions over to her. He told her that Bonnie was his daughter too, though not biologically. He had raised her and had been a part of her life since she was very little, like 3 years old. They had a very close relationship. Karen was frustrated and called Sergeant Morris for help, but he said he couldn't intervene. She needed to get a court order for something like that. Then he could assist her. So she did, and Gary was definitely not thrilled when they got to the front door with that court order in hand. He had to step aside. Karen went in and took boxes and boxes of Bonnie's things. Later, she went through everything and picked out items she thought might help the troopers with the case, like bank statements and other documents. Samantha and Adam were both interviewed. They were staying at Gary's that week. Samantha said she heard Bonnie wake up early, probably around 5 a.m., but she didn't see her. She wanted to get up and look out but was too comfortable in her bed, which she now regrets because that would have been the very last glimpse she would have had of her sister that she loved so much. Samantha did wonder if Bonnie was in a hurry that morning because it sounded like she was rushing around, but other than that, everything was normal. The confusion surrounding Bonnie's death left her family unsure of what to believe or whom to trust. After Bonnie died, Samantha began struggling. She struggled in school because she relied so much on her older sister. She shared everything with her and was lost without the support of her big sister. When Samantha lost Bonnie, she felt like she lost everything. At one point, Samantha even lost trust in her own father. There was one night when Gary was tucking Samantha into bed, and she couldn't help it. She was just 12 years old. She looked up at him and asked, "Dad, did you kill Bonnie?" Of course, he was shocked and hurt. He showed her no. He would never hurt her sister. I thought it was heartbreaking that this poor little girl had to question her own father. But in that moment, that's all Samantha needed to hear. Both Adam and Samantha independently told the troopers that the day Bonnie was killed, their father Gary was home. He was scraping ice off the car and then headed into work. They were able to verify his whereabouts with co-workers and supervisors, so they were able to rule him out as being involved. They let Karen know, but all she ever got in response was, "Let us do our job," or "We're working on it," even "We're looking into it," but nothing else. Karen had to put everything on hold because it was time for Bonnie's funeral. It almost didn't happen. Turns out burying someone can be pretty expensive. It was so unexpected. Karen was self-employed. She had only been working as a real estate agent for the past 10 months. It was $15,000 for Bonnie's funeral expenses, and Karen just didn't have the money. But they said they wouldn't release Bonnie's body without the funds. So, she scrambled around and was able to put it on multiple credit cards. It was tough, but what choice do you have when faced with this predicament? The service was held at a church that Bonnie attended from time to time called McHugh Creek Community Church. It was surreal. Everyone who loved and adored Bonnie showed up, including her biological father Gordon and Bonnie's boyfriend, who looked distressed. And just like that, it was over. Time for her loved ones to live out their new normal without her. A week passed after Bonnie's death, and Karen decided to start her own investigation. She began by retracing Bonnie's steps. She started at Gary's house on Vern Drive and arrived at approximately 5 a.m. before the sun came up. She wanted to be as accurate as possible, to know exactly what Bonnie's walk was like that morning and every morning. Karen walked a couple of minutes to a road called Legacy Drive. There were sidewalks and plenty of room to walk. She continued to Lake Otis Parkway, a major roadway that's adequately lit and seems safe enough. It's through a residential neighborhood. I don't know what it looked like in 1994, but there were no sidewalks, at least where it begins from Legacy Drive. There is, however, a bike lane. Karen was on this road for at least a good 15 minutes, and yet she was still nowhere near the bus stop. I estimate on the map that this is where she would have been after around 15 minutes. That's when the surroundings change a bit. No more houses, just forests on both sides. Karen actually gets confronted by an aggressive moose. It's kind of normal for this part of Alaska. The moose comes right out from the bushes on the east side of the roadway. She doesn't know what to do, so she hides behind a lamppost. The moose leaves but reappears again, almost taunting her. By the way, a couple of people stopped to talk to Karen. First was a guy in a truck who wanted to know if she was okay because he saw the moose. Second was a state trooper who was also concerned. Karen explained, "I'm Bonnie Craig's mother. I'm just retracing her steps." This clearly shows a few things. 1. Wildlife could have come after Bonnie on these walks. 2. There is a likelihood that strangers could have stopped to talk to Bonnie on this route a number of times. And 3. State troopers are also patrolling this area. There are negatives and positives and things in between. Karen had taught Bonnie from a young age never to accept a ride from a stranger, no matter what. So she knows better. She knows that unless Bonnie knew and trusted a driver, she would never have gotten inside someone's vehicle. But Karen starts to wonder, could Bonnie have been attacked by a wild animal and someone stopped to help, like the guy did in the truck? And maybe she was desperate, got in their car, and this apparent good Samaritan ended up hurting her? This area is a little more dangerous. It's isolated. Karen keeps walking, and the landscape changes again. It's around the hour mark at 6 a.m., and the area is busy near the bus stop. The likelihood that someone snatched her up in this location would be lower. She can't believe how far Bonnie had to walk to get there. It's just a 15-minute drive from Gary's house to the university, which makes me wonder why he didn't just give her a ride in the mornings. In Karen's book, she explained that Bonnie never told her about this. While Karen never knew how far it was, she thinks Bonnie didn't want her mom to worry. She didn't want to give her a reason not to let her live at Gary's house. Bonnie was telling Karen that this would help her get to the university, that it was close by and convenient. Bonnie was also headstrong like her mama, and probably wouldn't have accepted a ride because she wanted to work for what she earned. Karen was no closer to understanding what happened to Bonnie after she got to the bus stop. However, she did go back to her car and drove around, hoping she could locate Bonnie's backpack or any of her belongings for clues that might lead to a break in the case. But nothing turned up. This woman went everywhere. She went down into ditches on the sides of the roads. It was clear that Karen was willing to do anything for her daughter. She wasn't going to give up. But time doesn't stop for any of us, and before she knew it, it was 1995. A new year, but no new information regarding Bonnie's death. At least no news that the police were willing to share with Karen. Karen started off the new year with a call to Sergeant Mars and asked him one direct question, using the R word that I can't use. She wanted to know if Bonnie was forcibly violated. His response was, "Karen, we can't confirm or deny that." Karen wanted to know why, and basically Mars told her it was just not clear at this point. Karen started off the new year with a call to Sergeant Mars and asked him one direct question, using the R word that I can't use. She wanted to know if Bonnie was forcibly violated. His response was, "Karen, we can't confirm or deny that." Karen wanted to know why, and basically Mars told her it was just not clear at this point. It had been 3 months, so Karen wondered what was taking so long. But these things do take time. The truth is, the troopers did believe that even though Bonnie was fully clothed, her jeans zipped up, panties and bra intact, her shirt covered with a jacket, she could have been violated. The perpetrator could have ordered her to get dressed or could have dressed her himself. They did collect a swab as part of their medical examination, and there was male DNA present inside Bonnie. However, this information is kept under seal in California. Detectives gathered DNA samples from Bonnie's boyfriend Cameron, sent his sample and Gary's to the lab for analysis, and neither one turned out to be a match. Plus, Cameron could not have been in Alaska at the time of Bonnie's murder. Multiple witnesses saw him in California on September 28, 1994. Police investigated Bonnie's activities in the moments leading up to her murder. Bonnie's last sighting was on her way to the bus stop, the same path she took every time she traveled to school. There were at least 2 eyewitnesses, but there was no proof that she ever got on that bus. They believe that Bonnie was snatched up by her killer while she was walking in the darkness. She had a haunting foreshadowing conversation with her younger sister Samantha the night before she was killed. Bonnie told Samantha she was working on an assignment that she had to turn in the next day for her English class at 7 a.m. The topic was saying goodbye. Bonnie wrote about how she moved around a lot as a kid and had to leave so many of her friends behind. She also talked about her biological father, who wasn't around when she was a child. Within 24 hours of writing that essay, Bonnie Craig would be dead. Finally, Karen got some positive news in a way. Sergeant Mars called to let her know that they've made some conclusions in Bonnie's case as far as the medical examiner is concerned. Now, they were willing to allow Karen to view Bonnie's autopsy report. It was the second week of January in 1995, about 5 months since Bonnie was found. It was about time. There were a couple of caveats. Karen had to meet with the medical examiner, she could not have copies of the report, and she could not discuss the findings with anyone, not even her own family. She agreed. Karen met with Dr. Norman Thompson, who conducted Bonnie's autopsy, and he handed her the documents. The first thing that stood out to Karen was the manner of death. Homicide. I guess that was their new conclusion. Now, they could finally share this with Karen. She hadn't even received Bonnie's death certificate at this point, so this was the first time she had seen the manner of death officially ruled as homicide. In addition to what we already know, Karen saw that there were multiple blunt force trauma injuries to Bonnie's head, 11 lacerations in total. Plus, her left index finger was broken. The report went on to say that the contributing causes of death, if Bonnie was still alive when she went into that water, would have been drowning and/or hypothermia. She also had tearing down below, indicating forceful or rough intercourse. Karen wanted to know if this proved someone forced themselves on her, and Dr. Thompson said that part was inconclusive. They didn't know if it was consensual but rough or forced. He just could not be certain. But we know that Bonnie was in a committed, though long-distance relationship. But to the defense at trial, that wouldn't matter. They could argue that she was seeing someone else, but who? Well, that leads to the next piece of evidence that Dr. Thompson pointed to as something that could provide proof: the DNA. In case you are confused about where they're getting this DNA, it is from the semen inside her. If they can link it to someone, they could find out if there was a guy Bonnie was seeing and question him about his whereabouts and their relationship, etc. That's the only way to get to the bottom of this. So far, the state troopers have gathered DNA data from every guy who crossed Bonnie's path, and none of the samples have matched. Karen knows in her heart it's the killer's DNA left behind, not some random guy Bonnie was seeing. That just wasn't how Bonnie operated. But they had to prove this now. The medical examiner handed Karen the autopsy photos, and they were hard to look at. Clearly, the wounds on Bonnie's head were not caused by a fall. Dr. Thompson indicated the areas do not coincide with the position of her body. For instance, the back of the bottom of her head, but the weapon that made these wounds is unknown. This is still all a mystery. That was it for now. Karen had some closure, but she was even more determined to find out who killed her daughter. She made flyers and bumper stickers. A friend of hers, Sandy Cassidy, even started a group called Friends and Family of Bonnie Craig. They were trying to field information from the public and to keep Bonnie's name and face out there. The efforts paid off. Bonnie's image appeared on the sides of buses. There were bumper stickers with the words "Who killed Bonnie?" and more. Leads kept coming in. About a week later, there was a break in the case when detectives spoke to Bonnie's co-workers at Sam's Club. They talked about a man who worked with Bonnie and seemed to like her a little too much. Bonnie had even gone to her supervisor with concerns about this guy. He went so far as to use the company computer to look up Bonnie's employee record and get her phone number. He called her repeatedly despite her request for him to stop. Detectives brought the co-worker in for an interview and obtained a DNA sample, but it would take time to process. Meanwhile, another co-worker was reported acting suspiciously. He failed to attend a meeting at work that was held around the same time they believed Bonnie was killed. This individual also provided a DNA sample, and now they had to wait. Meanwhile, Jim and Karen invited Jim's brother Ken and his wife Valerie to visit. It had been 8 months since that 3 a.m. knock on their charter boat, when Ken informed them of the bad news regarding Bonnie. Jim asked Karen if she thought she would be up to taking a boat trip, but it would be close by, from Seaward to Whittier. It's something they used to do all the time, and it would be great to be able to take their guests out and do something. Plus, they could be back within an hour or two if they needed to for any reason. Karen was hesitant. It brought back a lot of memories, but all they had done was cry, investigate, wait, and grieve for almost a year. So, she decided it was a good time to at least try to change the pace. They grabbed the couple from the airport and off they went to the marina, where their 37-foot c.l.i.m.a.x named Sea Monkey was stored. I lived on a very similar style S2 sailboat growing up, and seeing this boat brought back so many memories. They planned to sail for about a week. It should be nice to just get away, grill some food, drink some wine, and enjoy the sights and sounds of the sea. But you'll never believe what's about to happen. On their last day, they're pulling into Whittier Marina. They radio in, letting the harbor know that they're preparing to dock. They're informed that the Coast Guard has been trying to reach them, that there's been an emergency. It's déjà vu. Karen is in disbelief. There are so many thoughts going through her mind. Is it going to be another one of her children? But this time, the message isn't for her, it's for Jim. The Coast Guard informs him and Ken that their dad had died of a heart attack. Neither one of them could believe it because they had just wished him a 63rd birthday a few days ago, and he was fine. Maybe boating is bad luck for them, but this is sad. The last 2 times they were on a boat, they received news that a loved one had passed. Now, they're rushing back, doing the same routine they did before, preparing for another funeral. They say bad things happen in threes. Tell me why. Once Karen is back from yet another burial, something crosses her mind. Could she have something to do with Bonnie's murder? Let me explain. As I mentioned, Karen had worked for the past 3 years as a reserve officer with the Anchorage Police Department. I had never heard of this before, but you can think of it as being a part-time employee who's on call, a backup for when they need more staff. Reserve officers are subject to the same standards of performance and department policies as sworn officers. Karen was used to working undercover operations, posing as someone buying drugs to bust drug dealers. This is a dangerous job. Karen had to wear a hood and a mask to conceal her identity. She would silently nod at the person who sold her the drugs so they could make a bust later. According to Karen, she had purchased crack for the Anchorage Police Department 5 or 6 times. She began to realize that her undercover work might have jeopardized the life of someone she loved so much, her daughter. Someone came forward, someone close to her, with information regarding Bonnie's death. They were convinced that after Karen was involved in a sting that resulted in the arrest of several members of a local drug lord's organization, that drug lord had targeted Karen's family. This informant told Karen that Bonnie was probably killed as a message to the Anchorage Police Department to back off. Wow, this could definitely be a major lead. So, of course, Karen wanted to let Sergeant Mars know right away. According to her, Bonnie was murdered the day after people she identified as drug dealers were released from prison, making the story seem even more credible. Despite the lengths investigators go to conceal someone like Karen's identity during a drug bust, once you're arrested, they can figure out who you were that busted them. Karen's name appeared all over the legal documents because, by law, an offender has the right to face their accusers. Karen rushed to contact Sergeant Mars, and he had news for her too. The DNA tests for both Bonnie's co-workers came back as negative, a match. That was even more reason for her to give him all the information that the informant had shared. However, Karen was not satisfied with the response she got. After she provided him with all the details, he just kept asking her where she got this information. He seemed more interested in that than in Bonnie's murder. She told him she was not going to give up her source. She promised she wouldn't sell, because she thought it was someone within the department. Afterward, Karen said this detective had almost accused her of obstructing her daughter's investigation because she refused to give that name. In turn, Karen said he refused to investigate further. She truly believed her undercover work could be the reason for her daughter's death. They could have killed her by mistake, maybe trying to target Karen, who used to live at that address and looked similar. Karen started feeling responsible for Bonnie's murder, but apparently the detectives did look into it and nothing ever panned out. The most important thing was to figure out whose DNA was found inside Bonnie's body. That would lead them to the killer, right? Or close enough. But the CODIS database was a new invention, its pilot program launching just 4 years before Bonnie was killed. It would not be fully operational until 1998, so unless they had a name, brought that person in, and got a sample of their DNA to analyze, they wouldn't find a match. Karen's surviving children went through a lot. Not only did they lose their sister, but it was almost as though they lost their mother as well. They did not get much attention. Sadly, Karen's life was consumed with trying to find Bonnie's killer. It was hard for her to focus on anything else. Even if there were brief moments where she had a chance to clear her mind and pay attention to her children, she was always pulled away by something. By June 1995, she had a new cell phone, which meant even more access to news about Bonnie. Sergeant Mars called her to let her know they had another lead. An instructor from the University of Alaska, actually the English teacher from that 7 a.m. class, Bonnie was on her way to when she died, contacted the police. This instructor told detectives that one of Bonnie's classmates might be responsible for her death. Wow, that's pretty shocking to make such a claim. But the instructor told them that the student had written some very strange things about September 28th, the day Bonnie died. Karen wanted to know everything, what was written, where, what was going on, but Mars didn't have much else to share. She had to wait to hear more. But not for long, because just a few days later, she gets a call from an unknown number. It's Bonnie's English teacher. Karen agrees to meet with her. The instructor provides Karen with the suspicious student's journal. After reading several incredibly violent writings filled with anger and just terrible things, Karen's convinced this is the person who killed her daughter. Twice in the journal, the writer referred to September 28th as a difficult day. He wrote that it was going to be a tough day and would put him to the test. Karen also learns that he didn't show up for that 7 a.m. English class that Bonnie was supposed to attend that day. However, the student did attend later on in the day, and he saw the English instructor. He turned that assignment in late, and the instructor noticed something. His clothes smelled like they had just been washed, and he had poured cologne all over himself. She asked him why he was turning it in late, and he said he missed class because he overslept. After learning all this, Karen was even more convinced that this was the guy. He was wearing cologne to cover up the smell of Bonnie's pepper spray. It does sound convincing. Karen also noticed that the writing had become more peaceful after September 28th, but all of this was really super suspicious. This is probably one of the biggest leads yet. Maybe he was driving to class. Bonnie knew him, so she wouldn't have been scared of him. He could have asked her if she needed a ride. They were going to the same exact class. And then he never shows up. Karen calls her kids because she wants to give them the news. She does this every time something new comes up in the case. Then she brings this journal to a forensic psychologist who agrees that the detective should look into it. Karen tries to give the journal to Mars, but he says, "Listen, we only go off DNA, and we're already waiting for those results. If we get a match, then we'll look into the journal." I guess it makes sense because it saves time and resources, but I'm sure it was frustrating for Karen. She begins to argue with Mars. This is a common thing for her. She said, well, if the DNA didn't come from the killer, maybe it came from someone else. Maybe he had an accomplice. She is met with the same response. They just have to wait. I understand where she's coming from. There have been many cases in the past where there are two people, and one person is forcing intercourse while the other person is committing another crime. I see where she was going with that line of thinking. She's unsatisfied with the detective's work, so she starts to look into Bonnie's suspicious English classmate herself. She found some very disturbing information. Her investigation revealed that he had been charged with battery and bailed out by a friend involved in another murder. This revelation made Karen think that maybe the friend who bailed out the student killed Bonnie. But weeks later, Mars lets her know the DNA was not a match, and she's angry. She didn't think the DNA mattered, she still thought this guy was involved. The investigation was back at square one. The detectives believed that Bonnie's routine would lead them to her killer. Around 5:20 a.m. on that day, a girl delivering papers in the area, Mandessa Bird, reported seeing Bonnie walking down the street in a jean jacket and a red shirt, which was accurate. Another witness came forward, a man who said he saw an unknown vehicle idling in front of Bonnie's house that September morning. The tip line received an anonymous tip reporting that they saw Bonnie talking to two men in a car at the bus stop on the morning she was killed. However, digging deeper into Bonnie's routine did not reveal anything new about her murder. They went over it time and time again, and 3 years went by. It's the spring of 1998. Karen hasn't stopped checking in with Sergeant Mars. She's putting up posters, doing interviews, raising money for Bonnie's reward fund, and investigating the case on her own time. By this time, Karen had actually decided to go back to work part-time as a reserve police officer for the Anchorage PD. Finally, there's a real break in the case, the first in a few years, and it seems the most promising because it has to do with DNA. Remember, that's all that Sergeant Mars said he cared about. So he calls Karen and says, "Listen, there's some news I want to share with you." He tells her, we're not sure about everything just yet, but we have a potential DNA match. The thing is, they've had several false leads prior to this, so Karen doesn't want to get her hopes up. But this sounds like it could be connected. He was the bus driver on Bonnie's route. Interesting. This man worked as a bus driver for the city of Anchorage, and he's also been accused of other suspicious acts, like attempting to pick up a 14-year-old girl, the daughter of another bus driver. Several young women came forward to accuse him of harassing them while they were on his bus. Mars also lets Karen know that this man worked as a substitute teacher in Pennsylvania, but was terminated because he made inappropriate remarks to female teenage students. Karen wants to know, do you have this man in custody? But Mars explains they don't. They're still doing their preliminary investigation into his background. He's just keeping Karen apprised of the situation. The bus driver no longer lives in Alaska, so that's another issue. He's in Davis, California. And get this, he moved there just shortly after Bonnie was killed. Mars said he flew out there to interview him, hoping that he would willingly provide his DNA for comparison. When detectives track this guy down, he denies playing a role in Bonnie's murder. He says someone's framing me. He also claims to have an alibi for the day Bonnie died. His stepmother said that he slept most of the day. Despite being cautious, he agrees to give a sample of his DNA without hesitation. He wanted to be cleared. He said, "This is not me." However, after the DNA test came back, detectives got the answers they were looking for. It was a potential match. The situation, however, wasn't straightforward because we have different ways of examining DNA nowadays. The DNA testing indicated a potential match, and even though DNA testing is the standard in forensic science, it was still in its infancy. This was the mid-1990s. It had a long way to go. An attorney for the bus driver demanded that they retest this man's DNA using much more advanced technology. Again, Karen and her family had to wait. But it wasn't long before Karen sees a message on her answering machine. It was Mars telling her to call right away. She wants to know, is it a match? She was really hoping that this would be over, that they had found the guy, but Mars explains they actually need to retest the DNA. So that was the call she was getting. He can't be cleared until they retest it. On both sides, they want to know, is it a match or is it not a match? I had so many questions because I was thinking, why would the test come back as a potential match? What does that even mean? Why would it even come back if he ultimately wasn't a match? It made me realize how grateful I am for the advances in technology, because getting a family's hopes up like this, putting so much time and effort into a person of interest based on obsolete science, seems like a waste of time. Not to mention accusing a person who ends up being innocent. It just seems like Bonnie's case is never going to be solved. But as I said, thankfully technology was advancing. They retested his DNA, and he is not a match. More years pass, and many things have happened, things that you don't usually hear in these cases, because you don't know what's going on in other people's lives that are connected to these victims. Bonnie's older brother Jason and his wife Tracy welcomed a baby into the world. His name was Austin. Karen becomes a grandma for the first time, which is very exciting. But there were also bad things as well. Karen was in a pretty bad car accident. It was a rollover accident with her friend Marcy, and it could have been fatal. It happened the day of her daughter Samantha's surprise birthday party. She was turning 15. Her friends were throwing her a surprise party, and she got 2 surprises that day. One definitely wasn't well received. When her friends yelled, "Surprise!" and jumped out, Samantha yelled out, "My mom was just in an accident." She broke down crying, and Karen felt so bad for ruining that special day. I just kept thinking about this poor family, because then Karen's youngest son, Adam, needed cornea transplants. His eyesight was failing. He was put on a donor list and finally had surgery on his left eye when he was 18. But then, when they went to do it on the right eye a year later, it was not successful, and he was left blind in that eye. There was another thing that no one saw coming. His girlfriend from high school was pregnant, but she didn't tell anyone. Not even Adam. She planned on giving the baby up for adoption, but when she gave birth to baby Jaylee, the state would not let her proceed with the adoption without the father's consent. It was quite a surprise because Gary got a phone call informing him that his son's girlfriend, Jennifer, just had a baby. So Adam flew out to Texas to meet his newborn daughter, and it was love at first sight. And then, surprise, 2 more bundles of joy. In 2001, Jason's wife Tracy had twins, Tanner and Logan. Plus, Jim proposed to Karen after they dated for 8 years, and she said yes. They ended up getting married. Sadly, there was also the Twin Towers attack on the US on September 11, 2001. So many back and forth, good and bad things. 3 years after Jim and Karen tied the knot, they were already divorced. But Karen kept his last name and was no longer going by Karen Campbell. She was going by Karen Foster. They were still seeing each other. It was almost like they were better in a looser relationship, not so committed. In 2002, Karen finally got an opportunity to have her theory about what she thought happened to Bonnie heard on national TV. Unsolved Mysteries reached out, and they did an entire episode where Karen explained that just because the DNA of the student in Bonnie's class didn't match, it didn't mean he wasn't responsible for killing her. It was obvious to Karen that there was a second person involved. From what she knew, she really believed the student had participated in Bonnie's killing. Although Karen did search for this possible accomplice, she was unable to locate one. She told Unsolved Mysteries that she doesn't think she could ever rule this student out as a suspect in Bonnie's death. Then, another tragedy in 2005. Karen's father called with the news that her older brother, Andrew, was dead. He had struggled with mental health issues for a long time and had attempted to end his life before, but he was able to get to the hospital fast enough to have his stomach pumped. This time, his wife, Anna, had filed for divorce, and it was too much for him to take. He left behind a daughter, Alana, and a son, Aaron. This wasn't the first time one of Karen's brothers died. 1 year after Bonnie was born, at the end of October in 1977, Karen's brother Kaj was involved in a horrific car accident that left him in a coma. Karen spent every day with him until he took his last breath. How unbelievably tragic. I just keep thinking, poor Karen. Death has been around her for most of her life, and I feel like she's cheated it a number of times, even once with her grandson in the woods. What was a nice afternoon turned into bears surrounding them, and she just knew right away to quickly and quietly get out of there. She never told her son Jason what happened. But it doesn't end there. The next year, in 2006, Karen is informed that her mother is not doing well. They call it failure to thrive. My grandmother just passed away due to the same thing. It's like they give up, feeling there's nothing to live for, and it's heartbreaking. Everyone around them feels guilty, but there's usually nothing you can do. In Karen's mother's case, they believe it was because she lost her son, not only one but two, and a granddaughter. Once she passes, they conduct an autopsy, which reveals she actually had cancer that had spread throughout her entire body. Like I said, I feel so bad for Karen. But at least, she did have something to celebrate. Samantha, who is now 24, was getting married to her high school sweetheart, Ryan. That's a lot of time to go by, it just flew by. For the new year, Karen decides she's going to take a trip across the country with her friend Melinda. It's January 5th, 2007. It's been 12 years since Bonnie was killed. Karen opens up her laptop in the hotel on a little island in the Philippines and scans her emails. That's when she sees it. An email from a sender she isn't familiar with, and the subject line simply reads, Bonnie. She said that her heart skipped a beat. By this time, a new team had taken over Bonnie's case. It was now considered a cold case. First, the new investigators went over Bonnie's file to ensure the original detectives hadn't missed anything. Eventually, an investigator named Tim Hunter introduced himself as the investigator with the Alaska State Troopers Cold Case Unit. He tells Karen he's aware that she's out of the country right now, but has something very important to share. He asks her to get in touch with him as soon as she can because there's been a development in Bonnie's case. Of course, Karen runs to the front desk of the hotel and calls the trooper immediately, but he doesn't answer. So she leaves a message explaining where she is and that she's going back to her room. Finally, she sees another email from him. It says they have information about a man who is in prison in New Hampshire. They're currently in the process of doing a background check on him, but he wants to tell her about what they've found so far. This sounds familiar, right? Remember the bus driver that didn't amount to anything? So, should Karen get her hopes up? Well, she runs back to the front desk and tries calling him again. He doesn't answer. Hours go by, then a couple of days. Finally, another email arrives. It says, Karen, I want you to know that there have been new developments regarding CODIS. He goes on to explain what CODIS is and lets her know that it is a national database for DNA profiles. It was developed by the FBI, and states are now entering the DNA of incarcerated individuals into the system. During a search of CODIS, a match was made between the DNA from Bonnie's case and someone in the New Hampshire legal system. They did a preliminary background check, and it turns out this man was in Alaska at the time that Bonnie was killed. Now they're going to talk to people who were close to him to gather more information. The trooper apologizes for giving this information over the internet and notes that the phone connection isn't working. He asks her to come in to talk to him in person as soon as she gets back in town. Karen has so many questions. This is big. She writes him back and wants to know everything. Who is this guy? How old is he? Was he working at Sam's Club? Did he know Bonnie? Did he have classes with her? Was he a friend of that kid in class who wrote the journal entries? But when Karen gets the answers, it isn't anything she could have imagined. It's no one they had suspected. The most important question Karen has is whether this DNA match is 100%. That would be good to know. Karen also wants to know more about this trooper because the detective in her is thinking, who is this guy? How much could he possibly know about her daughter's murder? Where was he the last 12 years? Was he even a trooper back then? Let me tell you all the information Karen wanted because it came in the next email from Hunter. First things first, the guy's name is Kenneth Dion. He was born in 1969, which means he's 7 years older than Bonnie. He would have been 25 at the time of her murder. He was incarcerated for robbery and was serving between 6 and 15 years. Although this man was arrested in 2003, his DNA was not entered into the database until late 2006. That's why his name had never come up before in connection to Bonnie's murder. Hunter was familiar with this case. He actually met with Karen early on. Back then, he was with the Criminal Investigations Bureau in Anchorage, but he transferred to the Alaska State Troopers in 1994. This man came out of retirement to work on Bonnie's case and was just assigned to it in March of 2006. By November, he got that match, and now they were in the process of attempting to extradite this man to Alaska from New Hampshire. However, Trooper Tim Hunter had already interviewed Kenneth. He tracked him down and initially played it cool, being casual and calm. He was asking Kenneth about his life, education, and his time in Alaska. He didn't want to tip him off or accuse him of anything related to Bonnie's murder right away. Once he was able to establish a rapport with the suspect, then the real interrogation would begin. Kenneth told him he was a 5th-degree black belt in martial arts and ranked 10th in a world fighting competition. Sure, he did. He talked about his relationships. Kenneth was married back in September of 1994 when Bonnie was murdered. Although Kenneth and his wife were now divorced, he said that he messed up big time and that she was the best thing that ever happened to him. Hunter found it strange how Kenneth never even asked why the Alaskan law enforcement officers had flown across the country to New Hampshire to ask him a few questions. Throughout the interview, Kenneth was civil and answered the questions as though he was an old friend of Hunter's. According to Kenneth, things spiraled out of control for him once he started doing drugs. His drug addiction led him to commit armed robberies to support his habit. Even though he cleaned up and enlisted in the military for a short time, he was kicked out because he kept doing drugs. He was constantly in and out of prison. In 1996, he moved to New Hampshire, where he continued to get into more trouble. During the interview, Hunter asked Kenneth if he had followed any of the local news while he was living in Alaska. Kenneth said, "Oh yeah, I always did." That's when Hunter asked if he knew about a girl named Bonnie Craig. The name did not ring a bell for Kenneth, or so he said. Earlier in the conversation, Kenneth had told the investigator he was better at remembering faces, so Hunter showed him a photo of Bonnie. Again, Kenneth said he had never met her and didn't know who she was. When Hunter examined Kenneth's body language, he noticed a change. It shifted from relaxed and casual to seemingly agitated, kind of rigid and scared. Backing up a little, Hunter wanted to lighten the mood, so he asked, "Well, maybe you guys had a chance encounter?" He laughed and added, "With an 18-year-old? No, my wife would have killed me." Kenneth actually laughed obnoxiously. That's when Hunter had had enough. He finally got right to the point and said, "One thing about it is, later they found her body dead in the McHugh Creek." When Kenneth realized what this investigator was implying, his smirk vanished. He said, "Whoa, whoa, 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 what are you trying to say?" Hunter informed Kenneth that his name had come up during Bonnie's murder investigation, and Kenneth acted surprised. He said, "I don't understand why my name was brought up." Hunter replied, "Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out." He asked Kenneth if he traveled around the state a lot. Kenneth said he had been to Denali a few times with his friends from the military and maybe Valdez. He also told Hunter that he and his wife used to party a lot, go out dancing, and that because of his cocaine addiction, he often got into fights at bars. He grew up fighting. That was his whole life. Remember, he was a top fighter when he was 17. Hunter asked, "What kind of weapons did you use?" Kenneth replied, "Martial arts weapons, things like an Akai, a prong-like weapon that sort of looks like a fork. I also used nunchucks and a 3-sectional staff." Soon, Kenneth began to catch on to what Hunter was trying to do and invoked his right to an attorney. At this point in the investigation, Hunter contacted Karen. They were now trying to locate people close to Kenneth. Finally, an ex-girlfriend was willing to speak with them. According to Kenneth's ex, he once told her that he could kill someone and get away with it. He said he couldn't go back to Alaska because he had done something there, killed someone. Fast forward to the middle of April 2007. An indictment is set, but no extradition yet. However, a pretrial hearing is going to move forward. Even if this man wasn't in the state, it couldn't come fast enough. Bonnie's closest family members attended the courthouse. It was completely packed. The charges against Kenneth were first-degree murder, second-degree murder with intent to cause serious injury, second-degree murder with extreme indifference to human life, and first-degree sexual assault. They couldn't add a charge of kidnapping because the statute of limitations had already run out, only 10 years. This hearing was not very exciting. It lasted just a few minutes at most. The judge handled it over the phone, with Kenneth's legal representation at the time. He asked if Kenneth could afford a lawyer. Kenneth said no, so they told him one would be appointed to him. They set up a pretrial conference for Halloween, October 31st, 2007, and a trial date for December 17th. Karen and her family were like, "Wait, what? That's all we got?" They were left wanting a lot more, and they got it. Soon after Kenneth's information became public, the media went crazy with it. Additional facts came to the surface, like the fact that Kenneth was in jail just 2 months before Bonnie's murder. However, he was out on parole when she died, and back in jail only 2 months after she was killed for violating his parole. And while he was out, like many criminals do, he allegedly committed a heinous crime. Kenneth was no stranger to crime. He had 18 convictions, 10 misdemeanors and 8 felonies. This man had never gone a full 12 months without committing a crime, except for a 3-year stint from 1999 to 2002. This is a bad dude. After all this information, Karen became a lobbyist for change. Had Kenneth's DNA been put in the database sooner, Bonnie's murder wouldn't have taken this long to solve. At the time, there were only 6 states that collected DNA upon felony arrests. So Karen presented legal arguments to Sarah Palin to change the law. In 12 days, they were able to get a bill passed and signed into law in June of 2007. As it should be, now there are 28 states that have joined the list of collecting DNA samples from suspects who have been arrested on a felony offense. After Kenneth Dion was extradited, he filed several pretrial motions, as many of them do, which stalled this case for years. Karen said that this was an unbelievably hard time for her and her family. Every time they had to go to a hearing or to the courthouse, it was like Bonnie was killed all over again. As soon as a wound would appear to scab over, Kenneth would rip it open again. But finally, he did face a jury in an Alaskan courtroom in May of 2011. Think about all the time that has gone by. This courthouse was packed every day. There was standing room only. The assistant district attorneys were Paul Miovis and Jenna Grunstein, and they knew that Bonnie's murder was most likely going to be a very challenging case to win. The DNA from Kenneth did not 100% prove that he forced Bonnie to have intercourse with him or that he killed her. Their DNA evidence only proved that Kenneth had sexual contact with Bonnie before she died. Aside from this DNA evidence, the state didn't have much else to offer. They had no murder weapon, no motive, and no witnesses. When Kenneth entered the courtroom and had his handcuffs removed, onlookers got a clear view of his knuckles. Across one hand was a tattoo that spelled lost, and on the other hand was the word stole. A lost soul. That's exactly what he was. A lost soul who found an innocent young girl and did horrible things to her. The trial began with the prosecutor's opening statement. The first thing that came up was a beautiful picture of Bonnie's face. She's smiling, and McHugh says, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Bonnie Craig." He went on to paint a picture of who Bonnie was, everything we already know about her, and probably much more. This included details like how she would make her siblings breakfast and pack their lunches before heading out for her day, how she would leave notes for them and buy them pizza, and how she worked 30 hours a week, studied in study groups, and would rush to the computer lab to email her boyfriend before and after class. He also mentioned how she had a psychology test that she failed to show up for on the day of her murder, but she had studied for it diligently the night before. Something else mentioned was a drop of blood on a leaf above the cliff. Karen never knew about it during the investigation. She found this out 16 years after the murder when the prosecutors took over the case. Before she knew about this blood evidence, the DNA pointed her towards understanding that something happened that was against Bonnie's will. But the blood indicated it was more than a man forcing himself on her. Kenneth's defense lawyers, Andrew Lambert and Leanne Bauer, were aggressive. Their opening statements were on the second day of trial, and according to the defense attorneys, everyone had been hearing for the past 17 years that Bonnie had been murdered, but it wasn't true. This was very hard for Bonnie's family to listen to. The defense attorney insisted that Bonnie fell. She just tumbled down this jagged, rocky cliff, striking her head and causing a skull fracture that led to her death. That's how she died, not murder. I think I would have caused an outburst in the courtroom. I don't think I could have held my tongue. But this defense attorney explained that just because Kenneth's DNA was inside Bonnie and on her panties, on the outside of her pants, doesn't mean she was murdered. Yes, it's true she had intercourse with Kenneth, but it was consensual. Oh my gosh. Don't they all say that? He mentioned the girl on the paper route. Remember her? She identified Bonnie as someone she saw at 5:20 in the morning. But he talks about what wasn't seen. Kenneth, a redhead, someone who would stand out in a crowd. Surely someone would have seen him, right? And no one saw his car, a black Ford Tempo. Other people said they saw someone matching Bonnie's description, talking to two guys with black hair, not red. And they weren't in a black Tempo either. Then the defense attorney mentioned a retired surgeon who jogged that area regularly. He saw a girl matching Bonnie's description, alive and well at 10 o'clock in the morning, jogging with two guys and another girl. He even recounted what Bonnie was wearing. He said she was wearing a blue denim jacket, a white scarf, or something around her neck, and he couldn't remember the color of her shirt, but he did say she had on white jeans or khakis and white tennis shoes. Indeed, this man got a lot of what he saw correct. Bonnie was wearing a blue denim jacket, white jeans, white Nike tennis shoes, and a matching white scarf. The red shirt was the only thing he didn't remember. Karen had actually met with this man a long time ago, and at the time she thought this was really vital information for solving Bonnie's case. But sitting in the courtroom, listening to this as the defense attorney goes on, she changed her mind. She thinks it may hurt Bonnie's case. Karen had actually met with this man a long time ago, and at the time, she thought this was really vital information for solving Bonnie's case. Not to mention the reason the surgeon recognized Bonnie was because he was familiar with anatomy, and there was a physical attribute on her eyes, epicanthic skin on her upper eyelids, almost the deep-set part of more almond-shaped eyes. This is very distinctive to him. Karen has it too, and he recalls seeing those eyes on that day and again in the newspaper after her death. That's why he came forward. The defense attorney went on to say that the investigation at McHugh Creek on September 28, 1994 was inadequate. For instance, he pointed out the fact that the state troopers had lost the crime scene video that they filmed the day Bonnie was found. Yes, that's right, they lost the video. When Karen heard this, that this video had been missing for years, it confirmed what she had suspected all along. No one cared about her daughter. Later she said she was sickened to hear how careless they were. The opening argument ended with the defense attorney mentioning the lack of blood. "One drop," he said. Shouldn't there be more for someone the prosecution is implying had been beaten with something like a tire iron? No weapon, 1 drop of blood, and only evidence of intercourse, which you can't even prove happened that day. All of this, in the defense's argument, means it was an accidental death. It was an intense day in court, but it only got more intense. The first witness to be called to the stand for the prosecution was Bonnie's little sister, Samantha, who had grown up and become a 911 dispatcher for the Alaska Police Department. Her job on the stand was to showcase all of Bonnie's amazing qualities. But on cross-examination, you know what the defense did? He went into her personal life, asked her about her divorce and her mom's divorce back then, and how there was such a complicated living arrangement, and the fact that Karen was actually on her second divorce and with her boyfriend on a boat, leaving her kids behind with her 18-year-old daughter who ends up dead. They were definitely trying to paint this family in a bad light. The trial was not off to the best start. And the next day, the prosecution calls Bonnie's boyfriend at the time. He's 34 years old and married, but his love for Bonnie was evident in his testimony. They met when they were little and reunited in high school. As he testified, he was grief-stricken. He said he had never suspected Bonnie of cheating. The prosecutor explains to the jury that Bonnie was too busy to meet a random man secretly. She worked at Sam's Club and was a student at the university, so why would she take time out of her busy schedule to have an affair with a married father with a newborn and a drug problem? They lived in two different worlds and would have never crossed paths. Bonnie would not have had random intercourse with Kenneth Dion. On cross-examination, the defense attorneys point out that Cameron didn't know about times when Bonnie exchanged numbers with other men, or a time she played pool with boys until after midnight. Yes, you know, like normal stuff that teenagers do, but they painted it as though there was something going on behind Cameron's back. Then, there was a letter from Cameron that he had written. He hoped he didn't want to force Bonnie into a long-distance relationship and ruin her college life. It was really making it look like they weren't that committed after all. The prosecution turns things around by asking Cameron about a ring that Bonnie had given him. He wore it for years after her death, and when questioned about it, he broke down in tears. He said that he loved her forever. While the defense attorney needed to remind the jury how so many people have secret lives that no one knows about. After Bonnie's best friend, Lynn Witt, testified about how much Bonnie loved Cameron and how committed they were to one another, the defense still rooted into her over this late-night pool game that they played with these three men in the Army. Especially since one of the two besties ended up dating one of these men, Lynn. She went on to get into a relationship, so what about her BFF, Bonnie? Lynn insisted Bonnie wasn't interested in any of these men, but the defense attorney ended with the fact that Lynn wasn't with Bonnie on the day she died, so she can't say who Bonnie was with, can she? She was like, no. He's like, you can't tell me whether Kenneth did anything to her, can you? She's like, no, I can't. The idea that Bonnie was involved with Kenneth doesn't make sense. Even Kenneth himself scoffed. Remember that he laughed when Hanyard merely joked about there being a chance of an encounter with Bonnie? Remember he was doing that interview? Kenneth laughed and said, no, my wife would have killed me. Karen was furious that this defense attorney was trying to smear Bonnie's good name, accusing her of sleeping with this random man, a criminal at that. Bonnie had a stellar reputation. The chances that her daughter hooked up with this married man, in her opinion, were zero. Therefore, the prosecutors let Bonnie's character speak for itself. She was mature, she studied, she was serious and faithful. Plus, why would some 25-year-old married man, who none of her friends or family had ever heard of, suddenly show up on a school day? Suddenly, out of nowhere, the prosecutor runs over to Karen and says, there's something major that just happened. And I'm thinking, oh my God, not again. But it's a good thing. They think someone at the state trooper's office just found the video of the crime scene, the one that had been missing for all those years. Yeah, somehow somebody from the department was reading the newspaper and said, oh yeah, I think I've seen that tape. Wow, so at this point, to process the discovery of this new item, the court decided to take a 5-day recess. Although this crime scene video being found should be good news for the state, since the defense had just received this newly discovered piece of evidence, after the trial already started, it could lead to a mistrial. It could prove how the troopers mishandled the case. However, Kenneth's defense attorney said the video did not warrant a mistrial, so the case moved forward. Karen imagined it was probably because this guy was pretty cocky and thought that he could win the case and that the video would actually help. But would it? It was very difficult for the assistant district attorney to play the tape in front of Bonnie's grieving family in the courtroom. Trooper Robert Beatty, the one who found the bloodstain on the leaf, testified as the video was shown to the jury. When Karen watched the video, she broke down in tears. Bonnie's family had never seen her in that horrible position, floating dead in the creek bed. Even though Karen couldn't stop crying, she made herself watch that entire video. As Karen watched, something amazing and transformative happened. It made her feel better. Seeing this video, Karen knew the truth now. Throughout the last 17 years of the investigation into her daughter's murder, the detectives and the troopers did take her death seriously. Karen realized that she had been wrong when she saw these investigators on their hands and knees, looking for evidence, hunting down the creek bed for the murder weapon. It changed everything for her. The next time she saw Trooper Honyard, she hugged him and thanked everyone. In that brief moment in the courtroom, 17 years of anger and resentment and tension just went away. But still, the prosecution had a problem with their case, even with this video, and you'll see why. On the stand, experts testified that Bonnie's pants were smeared with grass and her buttons were undone. A forensic scientist testified and noted that Bonnie had been forced into intercourse and physically harmed before being pushed to her death. He stated that the blood drop on the leaf that the trooper found was an obvious sign that something happened before the fall. The medical examiner who had met with Karen to go over the autopsy report, Dr. Norman Thompson, took the stand and testified that Bonnie's murder wounds could not have resulted from a fall. There were 11 injuries, blunt force trauma to Bonnie's skull. There were no signs of facial injuries, even though she had fallen and landed face down. All the while, the defense attorney, Lambert, was taking a bunch of notes. He was just chomping at the bit. He wanted to say something and couldn't wait to cross-examine this doctor. The doctor showed pictures of her defensive wounds and explained that the different wounds to her head would have come from separate blows. They were also too deep to be caused by a fall, even at that height. One of them had a very odd shape, like a T. The prosecutor asked if these wounds could possibly have been caused by nunchucks or other martial arts, like a sai, that fork-like object, and the doctor said yes, they could have. The defense, though, made some really good points on cross-examination. It was all about emphasizing the lack of blood spatter. I'm currently back in school doing death investigation again, and it kind of blows my mind that there wasn't more blood. To me, it's almost more likely that Kenneth picked her up from his car and threw her over the edge of the cliff after beating her almost to death in his vehicle. That could also explain why her belongings were not found there. But it's true, the lack of blood does add reasonable doubt. Not to me, because I think the altercation happened in his car, and this was because he was forcing himself on her. She was resisting. If you haven't seen Samantha Josephson's case, you may not realize just how severe someone can be wounded in such a small space. You'd be surprised. I'll leave that in the cards. At the end, on redirect, the doctor explained that the wounds are similar in depth, and it wouldn't be the same if they were from a fall. Those wounds would be varied. There would be scratches, contusions, bumps, bruises, maybe some lacerations, but they wouldn't all be the same depth and not dissimilar. This was done in a more controlled manner. He ended with his opinion that it was not even possible that Bonnie merely accidentally fell off the cliff. What do you think happened? Trooper Tim Hunter later said that the strategy he used during Kenneth's initial interview paid off during the trial. Remember, Kenneth repeatedly said in that interview room that he had never seen Bonnie and had no idea who she was. So how does he explain this change in his story? Is he lying then or now? Because you have to know someone in order to have consensual sex with them. There was a forensic scientist who went into detail about all these things, like how long sperm can live. But the thing is, Why would Bonnie be wearing panties and jeans that had semen on them from days or even a week before? I don't know, maybe it's possible. But the defense argues that Bonnie and Kenneth had sex, which was not on the day that she died, since there's no way to ascertain how long the sperm could have been there. That could put doubts in the jurors' minds. Kenneth's ex-wife takes the stand as well. She tells the court how Kenneth would disappear for weeks at a time. He wasn't even there when their daughter was born that same September that Bonnie was killed. She goes on to tell them she had even visited McHugh Creek with Kenneth after their daughter was born. This could have been before or after Bonnie was killed, but the fact is he was familiar with this place, and that's important. When leaving the courtroom that day, Karen actually called out to Tammy, his ex-wife. When she turned around, Karen gave her a hug and said, "I'm sorry." This is the ex-wife of her daughter's alleged killer. She told Tammy she was hoping that Kenneth would have taken a plea deal so that they could all be spared from having to rehash everything. Tammy just said, "Thank you," and walked away. I can't even imagine. That was probably so intense. Kenneth Dion never took the stand. The jury began deliberations on June 14, 2011, and the next morning, Karen and Bonnie's family were on their way to a family interview on TV with Channel 11, which was a local station. When they got there, in the parking lot, they saw the cameraman and the reporter running to the van. They were leaving. Like, what's going on? They yelled, "They're back." They were referring to the jury. They were back with the verdict. In Karen's mind, the early verdict meant it was going to be good news, and she was right. Karen was relieved when she heard that Kenneth was found guilty on all counts. She said that it was like a weight lifted off her shoulders, and everything was a blur after that. A lot of crying, cheering, and happiness mixed with sorrow. But at least there was closure. Despite the jury's verdict, Kenneth and his defense team maintained that he did not kill Bonnie Craig. At the October 2011 sentencing hearing, the prosecutor sought a 124-year sentence without parole, the maximum allowable according to the state. Kenneth did not show remorse or acceptance for his role in Bonnie's murder. Instead, he tried to be a tough guy and shouted out loud, "I won't take responsibility for it. I didn't do it." So when the prosecutor told the judge that Kenneth had never accepted responsibility, he said, "See, that answers that. There you go. See, he doesn't take any responsibility. He doesn't care." Kenneth Dion was sentenced to 124 years. He will, however, be eligible for parole at 80 years old. Even though Bonnie was mature for her age, responsible, aware of her surroundings, and armed with pepper spray, she was still overpowered by Kenneth. We will never know exactly what happened to her in that early morning in September on her way to class. But we do know that her death changed everyone's lives around her. As I mentioned, her sister, Samantha, went on to be a 911 dispatcher, and her brother Jason got his degree in paramedics. He said that after what happened to his little sister, he spends a lot more time with his own family and always emphasizes that that is the most meaningful thing in his life. He hopes his daughters can be like their aunt, but the heartache never fully fades away. Karen still can't believe Bonnie isn't here with her. It still shocks her that anyone would want to harm her sweet and kind daughter. Bonnie Craig's memory was honored with the creation of a homicide reward fund. This fund was set up to encourage Alaskans to come forward with information about 4 cold cases of young women. Karen says that the purpose of this fund can be expanded so that they could cover other unsolved murders if it's approved by the board. All I have to say is a lot of things, but I will say this. At least this case haunts me. It really does, as a mom. Knowing everything that this family had gone through and everything Karen had already been through in her life, we tend to forget the ripple effect of someone's murder. The intense longing to belong and feel accepted during our teenage years is a universal experience, etched in memory, no matter how much time has passed. It's a phase when we're highly impressionable, emotionally raw, and prone to impulsive decisions, all while quietly yearning for the comfort and validation of friendship and peer acceptance. Those fortunate enough to forge lasting bonds amidst the chaos of adolescence know these friendships are a rare and cherished treasure. But what happens when the very people you trust exploit your longing to belong, pushing things to a dark and unthinkable extreme? This is exactly what one young woman endured, and this is her story. I want to start today's story by introducing you to Adrienne Reynolds. Adrienne Lee Reynolds was born on September 12, 1988, in the city of El Dorado in Union County, Arkansas. When Adrienne first came into the world, her birth mom, Carolyn, was only 16 years old and was no longer with Adrienne's father. So it was decided that it would be in Adrienne's best interest for Carolyn's mother, Beverly, and stepfather, Tony Reynolds, to adopt the newborn. That is exactly what they did, and I think it's very honorable for Beverly and Tony to help Carolyn this way and take Adrienne in, raising her as their own child. It gave little Adrienne the stability she probably wouldn't have had at the time. Beverly and Tony truly considered Adrienne their own daughter. Unfortunately, when Adrienne was just 3 years old, Tony and Beverly decided to get a divorce. But the good news is that it was amicable, and they aimed to keep things as normal as possible for young Adrienne. Tony wasn't just going to step out of his adopted daughter's life. Even though they weren't blood-related, they were still very close, and he continued helping raise her, even though his marriage to Adrienne's maternal grandmother didn't last. Adrienne was an adorable kid with striking dark hair and eyes and a lot of freckles across her cheeks. She was happy, bubbly, and talkative, and like so many other little girls, her favorite color was pink. Due to her petite size, Tony nicknamed her Little Bit. She absolutely loved riding in Tony's 1969 Ford Mustang. The two of them would sing along to their favorite country music, and Adrienne loved telling Tony to make the car mad, which meant squealing the tires and burning rubber. Obviously, this was done in a safe way, and father and daughter both got a real kick out of it. They had a lot of fun together. They had such a close bond. Then, when Adrienne was almost 6, Beverly moved her daughter Carolyn, Adrienne's 22-year-old birth mother, to Longview, Texas, where Beverly had grown up. But Tony was still in Adrienne's life. He saw her regularly. At this point, since Adrienne's birth mom was older, Adrienne actually went back into her care. By now, Carolyn had another child. However, Beverly and Tony were still very involved in Adrienne's life. She grew into an outgoing, spirited, and energetic young woman who had a lot of spunk. She was bubbly and curious, and despite having a tougher start to life than many of her peers, this didn't impact her innate drive to make new friends and to get to know people. During 5th grade, she met Carlin Warren, and the two of them became best friends for many years. By now, Adrienne also showed a talent for singing, and she was absolutely obsessed with the reality show American Idol. Her ultimate dream was to one day be on the show, so she spent hours practicing for her school talent shows so that maybe she could make it there. The very first song that she ever sang for her family was her favorite, Amazing Grace, and the rendition took their breath away. Singing was a feature of the Reynolds family get-togethers, and when the karaoke machine came out, everyone laughed and sang along as they passed around the microphone. They loved to share Adrienne's love for music and performing. Being a creative soul at heart, she also loved to sketch, and she harbored a dream of one day becoming a fashion designer or painting detailed pieces on cars. Adrienne's birth mother, Carolyn, eventually married a man named David Franco and began working at a convenience store as a manager. But, as inevitably happens in many families, before Adrienne even hit her teen years, she began to clash with both her mom and David in a major way. By her 12th birthday, Adrienne was running with a rough crowd and she was skipping classes at school. She had actually fallen behind with her schoolwork and had suffered a burst appendix at the time. She recovered from surgery, but things did not improve academically because, aside from the social aspect, Adrienne absolutely hated school. Adrienne eventually spent a short time in rehab for smoking pot, abusing alcohol, and even taking prescription drugs. She was willful and defiant, as so many kids from troubled backgrounds can be, but she also began engaging in harmful behaviors like cutting, and had sadly tried to take her own life as well. Things were obviously not looking very good for the preteen, and something had to change. Even living with different relatives locally did not seem to help her, nor did homeschooling, which Carolyn did try when Adrienne was in 8th grade. But soon, the Department of Family and Protective Services got involved. I couldn't help but wonder if things would have been different if Adrienne had stayed living with Beverly or Tony instead of going back to her birth mother. But ultimately, things got so bad that it was decided it would be better for Adrienne if she went back into the care of her adopted father, Tony. Of course, so much had changed in Adrienne's life ever since she went back to live with Carolyn. However, Carolyn agreed that Adrienne would be better off away from the bad influences in Longview, Texas. By now, Tony had moved to East Moline in Rock Island County, Illinois, where he had grown up. He had also remarried, now to his high school sweetheart, a woman named Joanne. There was a bit of a back and forth when Adrienne first moved up to Illinois in October of 2003. She was only in East Moline for 8 months before she actually returned to Texas because, unfortunately, the kids in Illinois started to bully her for her strong Southern accent. Adrienne wasn't one to back down and be picked on, so she stood up for herself. Kids can bully someone to death, and it's very scary and heartbreaking. For Adrienne, things were not stabilizing in Texas either. Despite wanting to stay there, 6 months later, in mid-November of 2004, 16-year-old Adrienne again made the move up north, this time for good. She told her best friend Carolyn that she didn't want to leave her friends and go back, but she had no other choice because Carolyn felt Adrienne would be safer in East Moline. The community Adrienne moved to was home to about 21,000 people. It's in a region known as the Quad Cities area, where the Mississippi and Rock Rivers meet. The Quad Cities region includes Moline and Rock Island in West Illinois and the nearby border with Iowa. East Moline was a working-class, mid-sized city with a heavy focus on manufacturing industry and food processing as key to the local economy, like much of the Midwest. But it also had a family-oriented, small community feel, where most people knew each other. It was safe, with a relatively low crime rate. This time, when Adrienne moved back, Tony and Joanne decided to enroll her at a school called Blackhawk College Outreach Center. Now, though it has the word college in its name, it was actually for students of various ages and education levels, including high school. But this was not your typical mainstream high school. It was a similar type of educational institution for students aged 16 and over who were struggling to fit in at other schools, either due to behavioral or academic reasons. It was an alternative school, a place where these students had a second chance of finishing their high school diploma or earning their high school equivalency and starting to make their way in the world. It was a much smaller school, with only about 80 students, so it definitely created a more close and nurturing environment compared to a larger school where students could feel like they were not included. It was for students who needed more support and could easily feel like they were falling through the cracks. So this was perfect for Adrienne. We know she was being bullied, she wasn't fitting in, and she really needed the support. The change of scenery had given Adrienne a lot to consider. She knew that if she didn't buckle down and do well in school, it would stop her from her dream. At the time, her new dream was to join the U.S. Marines to help her get serious about her future and start earning her own money. Adrienne also got a job as a clerk at a local fast food restaurant called Checkers. Adrienne soon made friends with the entire staff and started feeling like she fit in. She proved herself to be a very valuable employee, coming in early and staying late. That Christmas, Adrienne received something that many teens dream about: her very own guitar, which she wanted to learn how to play so badly. It was black and featured a striking design of red and orange flames all over the front of the instrument. Adrienne was in love with her guitar. She played it so much that one of the strings actually broke. Tony and Joanne had planned on throwing Adrienne this huge graduation party when the time came. They were so proud of her and her progress in turning her life around. Because of the complex issues Adrienne had to deal with from her childhood, the family was actually in therapy, which was huge for everyone. Tony worked long hours as a truck driver, and Joanne worked at the local grocery store. But the couple was totally committed to helping Adrienne turn things around and give her the stability that she so desperately needed. One of her favorite things to do was actually go with Tony down to the YMCA, where he worked out. There was a dedicated space for teens to hang out, and Adrienne loved to sing while she was there. One of the most daunting experiences that we can encounter as a child, but even more so as a teenager, is actually moving cities and having to integrate into a new school. You want to meet new friends and quickly fit in. Adrienne was so far away from everything that was familiar to her. Not only did she have to focus on getting her grades back up so that she could graduate, but she was understandably worried about making new friends. She had gotten to know her adult stepbrothers, Joshua and Justin, and their families who lived with Tony and Joanne. But her biggest fear was remaining completely isolated socially from her peers. She desperately wanted to find her people so that she could settle into her new surroundings and feel accepted, which is something that many of us know is a big deal to teenagers. For a teen moving from the South to the Midwest, it was somewhat of a culture shock in a lot of ways. Wanting to meet people, but also feeling unsure of yourself. That's how Adrienne felt. So she was pretty quiet when she first started at Blackhawk, but as she started to figure out the social hierarchy and the lay of the land, she began to style herself so that she would blend in. She didn't want to draw attention to herself with anything outrageous or alternative. The thing is, as soon as she opened her mouth, Adrienne stuck out because her accent gave away the fact that she was a newcomer. This led other students to affectionately nickname her Tex or Texas. But at least they weren't making fun of her. She was also known as Pinky. Then, Adrienne couldn't believe her luck when one of the most popular girls at the school, if not the most rebellious, actually showed an interest in befriending the new girl from Texas. Having someone like that take you under their wing offers you an instant feeling of security and acceptance that so many teenagers crave and struggle to find. It reminds me of the movie Clueless, if you know, you know, when Cher takes an interest in the new girl Ty and gives her a makeover. Except this wasn't Beverly Hills, and these teens were a lot darker, I would say gothic even. The popular girl I'm talking about at Blackhawk was 16-year-old Sarah Kolb. Her style could be described as kind of grungy, kind of gothic, alternative. She definitely stood out in a crowd, and she wasn't only opinionated but very confident. She flaunted her attitude and her aesthetic, and many of the East Moline conservative parents found this very offensive. She wasn't the type of friend you'd be excited to bring home to your parents. They would definitely judge her because Sarah dressed in all black, wore a lot of band t-shirts, combat boots, dark makeup, and even had facial piercings. Sarah also didn't really care for authority figures. She was a fan of the Detroit rap and hip-hop duo Insane Clown Posse. I know if you're my age, you probably know who they are, and she actually called herself a juggalo or juglet, which is the name for the group's fan base. The juggalo vibe and aesthetic were intended to appeal to people who felt like outsiders, always on the fringe and misunderstood. That definitely described Sarah, and maybe even Adrienne. These were the kinds of people who found a sense of identity in being part of the counterculture. There was definitely a distinct style to their look, with juggalos often painting their faces like clowns, getting multiple tattoos and piercings, wearing black baggy clothing, and even colored contact lenses with really weird designs on them. Sarah was the sort of person who would be kind and generous among her social circle. She was well liked by those she chose to befriend. Otherwise, anyone on the outside of her circle could actually be afraid of her. For many of the kids at Blackhawk, her popularity was appealing. Sarah had the kind of magnetism and edge about her that attracted those who didn't necessarily want to follow the rules. As a teen, isn't that everyone? Her dark sense of humor and the general vibe she carried with her meant she was admired by a lot of the kids at Blackhawk, who looked up to her as someone who was tough and cool. This can be a very attractive proposition for kids who are easily influenced or feeling lost or insecure. So many teens are yearning to belong, and they want a leader, someone to follow, to look up to. When Sarah approached Adrienne during her cigarette break at school, Adrienne was over the moon. Not only did someone want to be her friend, but it was someone that everyone seemed to like the most popular girl at school. Adrienne was impressed and flattered. Whenever Sarah brought her to lunch or gave her rides home, Adrienne felt like she had hit the friendship jackpot. Remember, these things matter to teens. At the time, many of them can't see past life in high school, and they tend to be emotionally immature, falling fast into friendships and relationships, making them their top priority. Things had been unstable in Adrianne's life for so long, but now she felt like she had a good friend who was always there for her. They became best friends really fast, and soon, there was a hint of something more. That's because Sarah was openly bisexual at the time, when it was still very much taboo for teens to be comfortable in their own skin this way. This is most likely what drew Sarah to Adrianne in the first place. She was attracted to her. Even though Adrianne had always been straight, with all the attention Sarah was giving her, she began to feel open about possibly exploring her sexuality. In their letters to one another, the girls would discuss this topic and entertain the possibility of being more than just best friends. Now, I want to just mention that this sort of experimentation can be completely normal as part of adolescence. Teens are learning who they are and who they want to be, and the two of them seemed to have a mutual attraction that only made them get closer and closer. The young women spent hours talking on the phone together, and Adrianne felt that she had found her kindred spirit. Her confidence was growing under Sarah's influence, and Adrianne began expanding her social circle, meeting other students, including two guys, Matt Mitchell and James Caring. She also made friends with another girl named Amber Art. But soon, Adrianne's family and friends noticed that she was changing. It started with the way she was dressing. She was now emulating Sarah's style. She was dressing in black, cut her hair, wore dark makeup, and even wore nail polish. She even changed her taste in music. Instead of listening to the latest pop and country, Adrianne was embracing heavy metal. There was one thing that Adrianne was told she was not permitted to do. She could change her style and her music, but her parents did not want her getting any piercings. But much to Tony and Joanne's dismay, she disobeyed their rules. Adrianne came home with a DIY eyebrow piercing, courtesy of Sarah. Yes, she pierced it herself. As Adrianne's friendship group expanded through Sarah, she soon met 17-year-old fellow Blackhawk student, Harley Quinn. Now, I know you're probably thinking, Harley Quinn? So at this point in the story, I want to explain something very quickly because I need to provide some context to avoid any confusion moving forward. This part relates to the future and evidence that will be very important later on in this case. Now, some of you might already be familiar with this case and the people involved, but I have to address this briefly for those who are not. Many years after Harley and Adrianne were first introduced, Harley commenced gender transition. While she was designated male at birth and went by a former name, Corey Gregory, which does appear in court documents and much of the reporting on this case, she is a trans woman, and I will be referring to her today as Harley. But just understand that at the time Adrianne met Harley, she had not transitioned. She was living as a male and going by her legal name, Corey. I hope that all makes sense. At the time, Harley lived back and forth between her parents, Bert and Teresa, and had originally attended Mullen High School before transferring to Blackhawk at Sarah's urging. Sarah wanted Harley there with her. She originally met Sarah down at the North Park Mall in Davenport around early 2004, and they actually had a short romance. So they were a couple, but it only lasted a few weeks. By the time Sarah introduced Harley to Adrianne, Harley and Sarah were now just friends. They were pretty close, best friends, but they no longer had a romantic relationship. Sarah just wasn't feeling it, but Harley, on the other hand, was so enthralled by Sarah that she took whatever scraps her friend was offering if it meant that she could still be in her life. It was almost as though Harley wanted to be Sarah. She was that infatuated with her. Now, prior to Adrianne arriving at Blackhawk, Sarah and Harley were pretty much inseparable whether they were at school or not. But Harley was a very different type of personality to Sarah. Whereas Sarah was brash and outspoken, Harley was more reserved, even compliant. It was a friendship where Sarah held all the power, which Harley didn't seem to mind. Harley's parents were very much aware of how this dynamic played out, how Harley followed Sarah around like a puppy dog, totally captivated and pretty much willing to do whatever Sarah wanted. This can be very concerning as a parent to know that another teen has so much power and influence over your child, more so than their own parents do. Along with their other friends, Sarah and Harley spent their spare time drinking and smoking pot, and soon it was Sarah, Adrianne, and Harley. They were like the Three Musketeers, spending a lot of time together. But Sarah's general look and demeanor didn't endear her to Tony and Joanne, nor did it instill in them any confidence that Adrienne was hanging out with someone who had her best interests at heart. The Reynolds first met Sarah when she came to pick Adrienne up for a party, and the family dog actually growled at Sarah. She was a stranger on their doorstep. So Joanne and Tony weren't exactly thrilled that Adrienne was hanging out with Sarah, but what could they do? They wanted her to be happy, and this was the friend group that chose her, and that she chose to be with. Now Sarah was known by other kids as someone who was prone to being very moody, who easily manipulated people. If she was upset with you, instead of just talking it out, she let it marinate and stir. And obviously, this is not a healthy approach to conflict resolution, especially during the teen years when everything feels so dialed up. When it comes to relationships, things just feel way more intense. Sarah's friends, on the other hand, typically knew her as someone whose bark was worse than her bite. She was a show-off. She would threaten people all the time with her words. If they dared to annoy her, she would issue threats, but never follow through. No one ever took her seriously. She was angry, sure, but she would issue these empty threats. It was just part of her reminding people who was in charge. One night in early December, Sarah actually invited Adrienne to join her and Harley at a place known as the Party House. It's located at the Fox Point Apartments on 7th Street in Rock Island. This residence was rented by a group of young people, including Jane DeClaire, Corey Allison, Justin Morrow, and Brandon Cummings. The Party House was a place where anything goes. Teens would come to listen to music, dance, drink alcohol, do drugs, and hook up. Adrienne was so excited to go. She had never been to a house party before, so this was a big deal. And it was also a big deal that Sarah extended this invitation to her. But the thing is, Sarah had something else on her mind, another reason she wanted Adrienne to be there. She hadn't given up on the idea of actually becoming romantically involved with Adrienne, and she hoped that this could possibly take their friendship to another level. Maybe she could get Adrienne alone, and they could go into one of the rooms at the house party, and things could progress from there. But that didn't happen. Adrienne was just so excited about making new friends at this party, especially with a guy named Corey. She was flirting pretty hard with him, and by the end of the night, she ended up going down to the basement with him. Not with Sarah. Everyone who knew Sarah knew that she had set Adrienne up, that it was some kind of twisted test to see whether she was really interested in exploring things with Sarah or not. And she couldn't believe how quickly Adrienne just went and hooked up with this guy. Sarah decided that she didn't want to pursue anything with a girl who was so quick to engage in casual sex. Even though, quite frankly, it's none of Sarah's business who Adrienne decided to sleep with, because they were not a couple. Adrienne was free to do as she pleased. But Sarah was infuriated when she learned that Adrienne had been intimate with Corey. In Sarah's mind, she had done Adrienne a huge favor by inviting her to this party, letting her hang out with her friends, and now Adrienne was just off sleeping with some guy she just met. Usually, your friends would be really supportive of you in this situation, but not if they have feelings for you. It becomes a lot of jealousy. Sarah felt that Adrienne was not only ungrateful, but also not the kind of girl she wanted to explore a relationship with, or maybe not even be friends with. Sarah clearly only wanted one thing. She wanted to get what she wanted, whatever that was at the time. And she wanted Adrienne. So, of course, the rejection didn't sit well with her. Now, Adrienne took Sarah's completely unjustified overreaction as a sign that maybe it was better to make other friends. By now, Adrienne was much more confident and comfortable with who she was than she had been when she first started at Blackhawk. At heart, she was a gregarious, social young woman. So she thought, why not expand my social circle? Adrienne didn't want to have to rely on just one person to be close friends with, especially someone with intentions that she wasn't on board with. And there were plenty of boys who were very interested in dating Adrienne. There were just more and more people who wanted to hang out with her. For any teenage girl, the high of being popular can be intoxicating. And now, feeling braver than ever, Adrienne returned to the party house by herself in the following days. She knew that her friend Justin was going to be there, and she had been getting to know him. But that night, someone else turned up that Adrienne didn't expect. Sarah, with Harley in tow. When she saw Adrienne, she was absolutely furious. She felt like Adrienne was flaunting the fact that she didn't need Sarah anymore. Sarah began yelling, cursing, and getting right in Adrienne's face, embarrassing her in front of everyone. And much to Adrienne's shock, Sarah pulled out a knife and told Adrienne to get the hell out of the house and stay away from her friends. Adrienne's fear soon turned to confusion. She didn't understand why Sarah was doing this. She could tell that Sarah was clearly jealous, but this was an extreme reaction. Adrienne was shocked by Sarah's aggressive outburst that she burst into tears and ran down to the basement. After this outburst, Sarah just turned around and promptly left, infuriated. And that's when she called her friend Amber, ranting about Adrienne and how she felt publicly disrespected. Amber was concerned about how unhinged Sarah actually sounded, telling Sarah that maybe it was best that she and Adrienne just cool off, that they shouldn't be in the same place at the same time, at least for that night. Following this, Adrienne told Andrew that Sarah had threatened her with a knife in front of everyone. Still, Adrienne was intent on spending more time with Justin. It wasn't going to scare her away from doing what she wanted. A few days later, she returned to the party house once again, and one thing led to another. She and Justin ended up hooking up again. Sarah turned up there, and she was not happy. It was as though she was going there just to catch Adrienne doing something that she didn't agree with, kind of like a stalker ex. And they hadn't even been in a serious relationship. Again, Sarah pulled a knife out, threatening Adrienne by telling her not to mess with her. Thankfully, things did not escalate further, and Justin took Adrienne home. Now, despite how aggressive and threatening Sarah had been, Adrienne was so kind-hearted and forgiving that she still wanted to be friends with Sarah if she would take her back. Of course, Adrienne was hurt by Sarah's possessive behavior. She couldn't see why everyone couldn't just get along together and be happy and find a happy medium, instead of all this chaos for nothing. But that was how Sarah was, and what she thrived on. Adrienne was a good person, and she wanted to believe that underneath Sarah's bravado and all of her harmful words and actions, she was still the girl that she had first met, who showed her the ropes at Blackhawk and took her under her wing. Sarah had been her first friend, the first person to make her feel welcome. So Adrienne took a different approach and decided to show Sarah kindness. It's like that saying, you can catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. Adrienne thought, surely this would break through Sarah's tough exterior and things would just go back to the way they used to be. If they could only just have an honest conversation, things could work out. Adrienne then began writing Sarah letter after letter and coming by her house multiple times a day. But this strategy had the opposite effect. Sarah made it clear she didn't want to be friends with Adrienne anymore. She told her she actually hated her and took to bad-mouthing her all over the entire school. It was like, if Sarah couldn't have Adrienne obsessing over her and only her devoted to her, then Adrienne couldn't have any friends. Sarah was going to make sure of that. She wanted her to go away and leave her alone, just disappear. Now the lack of response from Sarah sent Adrienne into a spiral, and she began self-harming again. On the front of one of the notes to Sarah, she begged her to read it, saying she couldn't change what was in the past, but she swore that she could change now. Adrienne then began showing up at the movie theater where Sarah worked, and even had other people go into the theater to try to talk to Sarah for her. Adrienne was obviously desperate to make things work and for Sarah to stop bad-mouthing her. She was hoping to convince Sarah that they could still be friends. I really think this must have stemmed more out of not wanting Sarah to continue the bullying and bad-mouthing, rather than Adrienne truly wanting to be friends with her. But she was a very compassionate and kind-hearted person. However, on the other hand, Adrienne still very much wanted to genuinely connect with other people her age, and she wasn't going to give up on her new friendships either. She knew that when she was friends with Sarah, it seemed like all of her time was monopolized by that one person, and she didn't want that, no matter who it was. She also realized that true friendship wasn't meant to be abusive and turbulent, and it wasn't her problem if Sarah was jealous. So Adrienne bravely wrote Sarah a long letter saying she would not tolerate her bullying and called her out on her toxic behavior. Adrienne wrote that it was a mistake for her to have slept with the boys at the house party, but she wasn't going to accept the way Sarah was treating her regardless. As part of exploring her new friendships, by January of 2005, Adrienne was now spending a lot more time with a third person, Harley. Remember, the three of them used to be so close, but of course, that was when Sarah was there. She was the common theme between them. However, over time, Harley was getting sick of the way Sarah treated her. As well, Adrienne's gentle, easygoing personality was a refreshing change from Sarah's intensity and abrasiveness. Adrienne realized that Sarah had a sense of ownership over Harley, who, Adrienne felt, had been reluctant to push back against Sarah's dominance. She felt bad for Harley. So, Adrienne and Harley began writing cute notes to one another, kind of like how Sarah and Adrienne used to do with one another. Adrienne sent one saying that she actually loved Harley because she was respectful, cute, nice, and honest. Adrienne felt that Harley was one of the sweetest people she had ever met, which opened up Adrienne to trust her more. The pair spoke for hours on the phone, and by mid-January, they were hanging out together without Sarah all the time. I'm sure you can guess that Sarah would not be happy about this, and it wasn't exactly a secret either. Adrienne didn't feel like she should sneak around to spend time with Harley. But when Sarah found out, she was actually mad at Harley. Instead of doing what she did to Adrienne, Sarah was more open to reconciling with her longtime friend and ex Harley. But of course, she was way easier to manipulate as well. There wasn't any forgiveness for Adrienne, though. Of course, we know that even as adults within tight friendship groups, people can spend time one-on-one or just with a few people without everyone trying to be included. Not every get-together includes everyone. Not only is it impossible in terms of logistics with all of our busy lives, but it's important to nurture friendships in this way. In adolescence, though, and your teens, the idea that not everyone is automatically included in everything can cultivate a sense of insecurity and exclusion that causes conflict. It can also feel like a deep sense of rejection. Adrienne knew she didn't need Sarah's permission to hang out with Harley, but she also knew that Sarah was too emotionally immature to understand that or accept it. Sarah lived in a black and white world where, if you weren't with her or for her, then you were against her. Sarah openly continued disrespecting Adrienne to other people. She spread really nasty rumors about her that were not true, threatened other kids not to hang out with her, and made Adrienne incredibly distressed by telling her she should actually take her own life. Sarah even gave her a really nasty nickname, Jiffy, after the peanut butter brand. This is a term that Sarah used for girls who engaged in casual sex, saying that they spread their legs as easily as peanut butter spreads on bread. It's so childish, but for a teen, it would be considered very hurtful. Adrienne finally confided in Joanne that Sarah's bullying scared her, but still, she was willing to do anything to repair their friendship. She couldn't understand why Sarah was so toxic. She pleaded with her in one letter, wanting to know why Sarah hated Adrienne so much and wanted her to die. I'm introducing something new to these videos that I think you'll find really helpful. Short recaps to keep everyone on track with the key facts. I know many of you watch while multitasking, whether you're cleaning, driving, or working, and it's easy to lose track or feel confused. These quick summaries will help you catch up and stay in the loop, so you won't miss a thing. Let's get started. 16-year-old Adrienne had a turbulent upbringing. Her birth mother, Carolyn, was only 16 when she had her, so she was raised by her maternal grandma, Beverly, and her step-granddad, Tony, until they got divorced. Then, she eventually went back to live with her birth mother when she was in the first grade, but this ultimately didn't work out. Adrienne began rebelling as she got older, eventually getting into a tough crowd at 12 years old and even getting into drugs. So she was sent back to live with Tony and his new wife, Joanne, out in Illinois, and was enrolled in an alternative high school called Blackhawk, where she hoped to make new friends. The most popular girl at the school, Sarah Kolb, who was openly bisexual, showed an interest in Adrienne and took her under her wing. They became best friends at first and hung out with Sarah's ex, Harley. They were all very close until Sarah began to want more from Adrienne romantically. Even though Adrienne entertained the possibility of the two girls being more than friends, Adrienne ultimately found her own footing and began branching out, even deciding to get close to two guys, Corey and later Justin, who she ended up hooking up with. This infuriated Sarah, who felt rejected. So, she started a hate campaign against Adrienne at Blackhawk School, trying to ruin her reputation, even pulling a knife on her several times, threatening her and calling her names, trying to turn every student against her. But those who knew Sarah said she was all talk and only trying to look dangerous. She wasn't. Even though all of this had happened, kind-hearted Adrienne still wanted to reconcile with Sarah. But no matter how hard she tried, Sarah would not forgive her. Eventually, Adrienne began spending more time with Harley without Sarah, and of course, when the two of them became close, it made Sarah even more angry. She ended up forgiving Harley, but not Adrienne, who even confided in her guardian Joanne that she was scared of Sarah and didn't understand why Sarah said things like how she hated Adrienne and hoped she would take her own life. So now you're up to date on everything that went on in case you missed anything. Now that the recap is over, let's go back to the story. On Friday, January 21st, 2005, Joanne woke Adrienne up and she headed off to school as usual. She got a ride from her stepbrother, Justin. She had said goodnight to Tony the night before because he had to be up really early at 4 a.m. for work. Adrienne had a 5 p.m. shift that afternoon at Checkers after school. She was planning on coming home to change and then heading out to work later that afternoon. Tony and Joanne were at home and noticed that Adrienne's work uniform was still in her bedroom, which was odd. She should have been at work by then, and there were no other clothes or belongings indicating that Adrienne had come home and headed back out again. When Joanne called around to see if anyone had seen Adrienne, no one had. So the couple got in their car and drove up to Checkers, where they learned that Adrienne did not show up for a shift, nor did she pick up her paycheck. At first, Tony was irritated, and rightfully so. He thought this was really irresponsible of his daughter. But he also wondered if something had happened that made her run off. As the hours passed, Tony and Joanne had this growing sense that something was really wrong. They frantically made phone calls to everyone they could think of, leaving multiple voice messages for everyone who knew Adrienne. She was only 16 years old, still so young and vulnerable. Now, Joanne and Tony had Harley's number, along with other friends, including Sarah. When they talked to Sarah, she said she hadn't seen Adrienne since she and Harley dropped her off earlier that day at McDonald's on 727 Avenue when they got out of school. Sarah did mention that the two of them had an argument, so she drove off with Harley, leaving Adrienne behind. When Joanne and Tony talked to Harley, she gave them the exact same story. By 7:30 p.m., Tony and Joanne's concerns had grown even more. They drove around the town looking for Adrienne, including going over to Harley's house, but there was no sign of her. If Adrienne was with a friend, why didn't she reach out to them? She couldn't drive, and she didn't have a cell phone because she actually knew how much she talked, so she couldn't afford it. Back then, you had to pay for minutes. So where was she? They knew Adrienne had never run away. As troubled as she had been, that just wasn't something she would have ever done. By 8 p.m., the Reynolds reported her missing to the East Moline Police Department. Tony called Adrienne's birth mother, Carolyn, down in Texas to let her know that Adrienne was gone. Without hesitation, Carolyn began making plans to jump in her car and make a 12-hour trip to Illinois that same night. Officer Josh Allen from the East Moline Police Department called Sarah to see if she knew anything about what happened to Adrienne. She explained that after leaving school at lunchtime, she, Harley, and Sarah's new boyfriend, 16-year-old Sean McKittrick, had given Adrienne a ride. They dropped her off at McDonald's between about 12:30 and 1 p.m. It was the one across the street from Adrienne's house. Sarah explained that Adrienne didn't want to be taken home because she didn't want her parents to see her in a car with a boy. Now, remember that Harley had not transitioned at this stage, so that's what this comment was referring to. It was about Adrienne being in the car with Harley, who was Corey at the time. Sarah added that Adrienne was wearing a bright orange hoodie and blue jeans. She made it clear that the pair were no longer friends, saying that she actually hated Adrienne because she felt she was promiscuous. Sarah admitted that the girls had an argument at school and that Sarah wanted to sort things out. So, she gave Adrienne a ride home so they could talk. But after talking, they still could not see eye to eye. Sarah said she had no idea what happened to Adrienne, but she did express concern that maybe Adrienne had run away from home. She didn't explain why she would think that. Sarah gave the names of other people who knew Adrienne so the police could question them. But then she had a kind of odd question for the police. She wanted to know, given that she was the last person to see Adrienne, if this meant that there would be a warrant out for Sarah's arrest. I understand you're 16, and you don't really know how the law works. But Officer Allen assured her that that wouldn't be the case unless she was holding Adrienne captive or preventing the police from locating her. Sarah told Officer Allen that she'd appreciate it if they would let her know if they found her friend or her former friend. The Reynolds were distributing hundreds of flyers all around town, especially to motorists at fast food restaurants. Tony kept driving around looking for Adrienne, circling back to the party house at Fox Point Apartments, and even peering into every car he passed. The story of Adrienne's disappearance soon made news headlines, and everyone in Eastmoreland knew about the missing teen. It was all hands on deck. As a matter of fact, many agencies and officers were working on the case. Illinois State Police Special Agent Sergeant Mike Sheckley led the investigation, assisted by Sergeant Mike Britt, Eastmoreland Police Chief Victor Moreno, Captain Bob Fuller, Detective Sergeant Brian Foles, Rock Island Police Captain John Wright, and Sergeant Tim Stein, as well as the Quad City Metropolitan Enforcement Group. Now, while all this was going on, Tony and Joanne thought that something was off about Sarah's claim as to why she didn't just drop Adrienne directly at home. Plus, recall that Adrienne had confided in Joanne that she was fearful of Sarah, and there was no way anyone would have seen her in a car with a boy because Tony and Joanne were at work. So, it didn't make any sense. Adrienne knew they were at work. She knew no one would see her with a boy. The following night, on Saturday, January 22nd, Eastmoreland Police Officer Kevin Johnson checked in with Sarah at work to see if she had heard anything. She said she hadn't, but she would let them know if she did. Officer Johnson also wanted to follow up on what Sarah originally told them because Harley had a slightly different account. Harley had told law enforcement that she didn't know what Sarah and Adrienne had been arguing about. As far as she knew, the two girls had made up before Adrienne got out of the car. It's a little bit of a different story. Remember, Sarah said they still didn't see eye to eye, but now she told the officers that they initially drove to Taco Bell. And things got physical in the vehicle when Sarah accused Adrienne of being promiscuous. Sarah admitted that she hit Adrienne, and then Adrienne fought back. Afterward, Sarah's boyfriend Sean got out of the car and took off during the argument. That's when they drove to McDonald's near Adrienne's house. The girls then apologized to each other, and even though they still weren't friends, there was no longer any bad blood. Sarah then dropped Adrienne off, and that was it. Sarah explained that the information Harley had given the police was so different because she had actually told Harley not to say anything, not to alert them to the altercation, because she didn't want to raise any concerns. But she also wanted to tell the truth, so that's why she came clean. Sarah explained that she and Adrienne were not really friends, but that everything was cool at the end of the drive. In the absence of any news, the Reynolds felt helpless. Joanne was so desperate that she actually called a psychic for advice, but this didn't offer any insight either. At least, maybe it offered a little hope since the psychic told Joanne that Adrienne was still alive and in someone's basement. Of course, I can only imagine holding on to any hope that you can. One day after her disappearance, Adrienne had plans to babysit for her coworker, John Beauchamp, on that Saturday night, but she never showed up. Even though everyone was hoping that she would, it wasn't like her to disregard her responsibilities. But then, with the town being as small as it was, police started hearing rumors from the local teens, including Adrienne's friends. They wondered if something terrible had happened to her. Had Adrienne been the target of violence? It sounded too horrible to be true, but if she had been beaten up and left somewhere to fend for herself, she could be in real trouble. Was she lying somewhere, injured? They wondered, considering it was the middle of winter at the time. It was freezing, and the overnight temperatures got down to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Everyone also knew about the drama between Adrienne and Sarah. She'd been intertwined in Adrienne's life like no one else. But Sarah was adamant. She told Tony she hadn't seen or heard from Adrienne since Friday afternoon, and neither had Harley. That's what both of them kept telling the police who were checking in with them over the weekend. Tony was no longer mad at Adrienne for not coming home or contacting them. Like Joanne, he was now really scared, and he just wanted Adrienne to come home. In the meantime, a couple named Vernon and Connie Bennett, who were having lunch at Taco Bell on the day in question, had contacted police. The couple noticed a red vehicle in the parking lot at the time and told police that it looked like a fight was happening in the back seat of that car. They said they saw a young woman sitting in the passenger side who fit Adrienne's description. Even though Adrienne was not missing at this point, Vernon was so concerned about this fight that he took down the model of the car and passed this information on to his wife. When she saw a picture of Adrienne in the newspaper several days later, she recognized her. But we do know that Sarah already admitted there was a physical altercation that happened between her and Adrienne. So, what happened after the fight? That's what investigators wanted to know. Police knew that if anyone had any information, significant or not, about how things were going for Adrienne in the lead up to her disappearance or afterward, it would be her friends at school at Blackhawk. Amber told police that just before Adrienne went missing, Sarah had called to ask for ideas about where she and Adrienne could chat undisturbed. Okay, that adds up because we know that Sarah told investigators that she and Adrienne were trying to discuss their issues. Another student, James Caring, told law enforcement that Sarah had told him she was angry with Adrienne and was actually going to beat her up. Now that's a different story. He said that Sarah had actually invited him to lunch on the day that Adrienne disappeared, but he declined because he had other plans. So, in response, Sarah said she was going to have fun. This makes it appear that Sarah had cruel intentions from the beginning and didn't merely want to chat with Adrienne, but instead, she was going to harm her. And now, she's missing. That's a red flag. By Monday, January 24th, with Adrienne still missing, a whole weekend had now passed. Sarah and her mom, Catherine, showed up with their attorney, Bob, at the police department. They were there to give Sarah's account of what had happened so everything could be squared away. What investigators wanted was more information about what Sarah did after leaving Adrienne behind. Sarah told Detective Foles that after she dropped Adrienne off, she and Harley went back to Sarah's place, where she changed her outfit and then went to her grandparents' house for her grandmother's birthday. She told them that Adrienne was perfectly fine when she got out of the car, but Sarah refused to corroborate this with the polygraph test. Now granted, polygraphs aren't foolproof. We've heard a million times that they can also be used to intimidate witnesses. Now Harley's mom, Teresa, got word that Sarah had an attorney, and she was pretty surprised when Harley said that maybe she should get one. The reason why, Harley explained, was because police had been asking her and Sarah a bunch of questions. And remember, they're minors, so that is a big deal, and they should have counsel to guide them. As a matter of fact, law enforcement had even searched Sarah's red 1991 Geo Prism, but they didn't notice anything of concern, other than maybe the trunk smelling a little bit like gasoline, and there were some lighters in the car. Teresa thought getting an attorney for Harley was kind of a weird request, especially because she said, "If you didn't do anything wrong, why do you need to worry about it?" But Harley still seemed worried, so her dad, Bert, arranged legal representation so that Harley could feel more comfortable speaking with police, which, for any young person, could be very intimidating. So, I think that's the right move for anyone being interviewed by the police. Later that day, Harley, her attorney, and Bert showed up at the East Mullen Police Department. Harley answered Sergeant Shaquille and Detective Foltz's questions, and everyone seemed satisfied that she told law enforcement everything she knew, even though she too refused to sit for a polygraph. But the next day, on Tuesday, January 25th, Harley's family could see that she was in deep emotional turmoil. In the days since Adrienne had gone missing, she was weepy and emotional, and she couldn't even sleep. Of course, everyone was worried about Adrienne, but Harley's dad, Bert, knew that this behavior was beyond the normal level of concern, so he confronted her. Bert asked Harley, "What is going on?" And that is when she caved. She said that something terrible had happened to Adrienne, and now Harley wanted to talk to the police again. What she explained was why she wanted a lawyer in the first place. At the same time, State Police Special Agents Chad Burrs and Chris Andrus were in the process of organizing a search of a 16-acre farm belonging to Brian and Mary Angle, who just happened to be Sarah's grandparents. This farm was situated in Millersburg, near Aledo, in a rural part of Mercer County. Now this is about a 46-minute drive from East Moline, and the reason they were going out there was because Sarah's grandfather, Brian, had told the officers that after 6 p.m. on Friday, January 21st, there was a strange vehicle driving around without headlights on in an isolated part of his property. So, Brian drove out to see who was in the car, and then he realized it was actually his granddaughters Sarah and Harley. Sarah told her granddad that she was just showing Harley around the farm, but Brian knew she would have had to go off-road to get where she was, which was difficult in her geoprism, so that seemed suspicious, but not as suspicious as when he later found out that Adrienne had gone missing. Later that Friday evening, Sarah drove to her grandparents' house like she said she did, while Harley waited outside. Brian thought Sarah was behaving strangely, mostly because she hugged him several times and told him she loved him, which was not like her. It was also weird that Sarah went to the farm with a friend and not her mom, because she never had gone out to that farm without her mom, Catherine. Back at the East Moline Police Department, Harley told Sergeant Shaquille and Detective Foltz that on January 21st, Adrienne took up Sarah's offer of a ride home from school. In the car were Harley, Sarah, Adrienne, and Sean. They all left the school in Sarah's car and drove to that local Taco Bell to get some lunch, which was only down the street, about a 5-minute drive away from Black Hawk. Adrienne was in the front passenger seat, Sarah was driving, and according to Harley, she and Sean were in the back. Sarah said that she knew Adrienne and Harley had been making out when they hung out together 2 days prior, on the night of January 19th. This was true, and it somehow got back to Sarah, no one knew how, but she was mad. Sarah also learned that Adrienne had asked Harley out, meaning she wanted to be more than friends. But remember, Adrienne was interested in boys. In the context of our story, Harley hadn't transitioned at this time. Even though Sarah was already dating Sean, she was furious that Adrienne would pursue her ex, and evidently, Adrienne had also commented that Sean was hot when Sarah asked Adrienne what she thought of him. It seems pretty petty, but it's typical for teenagers. The discussion soon became heated, and by the time they pulled into that parking lot, things escalated. According to Harley, Sarah lashed out at Adrienne, hitting her, cursing at her, and calling her names. She then grabbed Adrienne's head, forcing her to turn around and look into the back seat at both Harley and Sean, and Sarah demanded that Adrienne stay away from both of them. Harley said that while all this was going on, she was sitting in the back seat and didn't want to intervene. Even as people were walking past, she said that at least 10 people had walked by, but from her perspective, she felt that Sarah and Adrienne just needed to fight it out, and trying to break up the physical altercation wouldn't have diffused the tension. Harley said she just sat, looked out the window, and smoked a cigarette, but Sean didn't like what was going on, and he told Sarah to stop. She snapped back at him that if he didn't like what was happening, then he should leave. So he did. He got out of the car and walked back to school. Harley explained that at this point the two girls in the front seat were continuing to struggle, with Adrienne trying as hard as she could to defend herself from Sarah's attack. But when Adrienne struck Sarah in the nose, this was a turning point, and things were about to get much worse. Apparently, according to Harley, Sarah grabbed a long wooden stick that she kept in the car and used it as a weapon, beating Adrienne with it. Now, just to give you a little idea of what Sarah was like, this stick was the handle of a hammer or an axe. But Sarah actually referred to it as something very offensive, using the N-word, in reference to it being used to beat off people she called the N-word, Not cool, disgusting. As the struggle continued, the girls ended up in the back seat with Harley, who jumped out of the car and got into the front passenger side to get out of the way. Why didn't Harley intervene? This seemed to be an extreme attack. But according to Harley, it was now when she decided things had to stop. But instead of going to help Adrienne, Harley jumped on her, pinning Adrienne's arms down and restraining her. I was so surprised when I read that. And then she said before she knew it, Sarah was actually strangling Adrienne in the back seat. You'd think that Harley would do everything she could to stop Sarah, but instead she apparently pulled out a belt and placed it around Adrienne's neck. I cannot even begin to imagine the sheer panic and horror going on in Adrienne's mind at this point, not just because of the attack by Sarah, but because of the realization that Harley, someone Adrienne thought was a friend and trusted, had betrayed her. She was helping Sarah do something so awful and frightening. Everything crystallized in that very moment for Adrienne. She knew where Harley's true loyalties were. Harley later said, very arrogantly about her actions, that she would always be on Sarah's side, which is just unbelievably chilling and disgusting. Harley was adamant that things just got out of control, and she claimed she had no idea about Sarah's intentions when she got in the car that afternoon. But then, things just reached a point of no return, and she found herself just following Sarah's lead. Then Harley stated that she and Sarah initially thought Adrienne was just unconscious, not dead. But then, when they realized what they had done, Sarah started to panic. Harley said she realized Adrienne was dead because her face and her lips were blue. What did they think was going to happen if you deprive someone of oxygen? Harley explained that she and Sarah sat and worked out what they were going to do next while just smoking a cigarette. How cold and callous can these people be? Sarah then told Harley she needed help disposing of Adrienne's body. So they drove to Sarah's place, got a 2-gallon can of gasoline, a blue tarp, and a long forked gardening tool from the garage, throwing them into the car. Harley continued telling the police that she and Sarah drove to Sarah's grandparents' farm, and that is when they wrapped Adrienne's body in the blue tarp, dragged it away from where it would be visible. Then Sarah grabbed the can of gasoline, poured it all over Adrienne's body, and using a butane lighter, she set her remains on fire to get rid of all the evidence. This is so stomach-turning to contemplate, an extremely callous thing for anyone to do, let alone 2 teenagers. Harley told officers that she and Sarah went inside the car and listened to music to pass the time. That's unbelievable, while a person is burning right outside of that car. They weren't even worried that someone would catch them in that moment. And as time passed and the fire dwindled, they soon realized that Adrienne's remains were not just disintegrating in the flames like they thought they would. This is when Harley told police that she and Sarah drove into town and went to Sarah's grandmother's antique store, called Treasure Hunt, to again pass some time. Then, they went and got more gasoline and went back to the farm. That's when they ran into Sarah's grandpa, who was mad that they were on his property. After they were done speaking with her grandpa, Harley said Sarah poured the rest of the gasoline on Adrienne's remains, but this did not speed up the process. Sarah thought Adrienne's body would just burn into a pile of ashes, and there would be no trace of her. She would just disappear like she never existed. But now they had to figure out what to do next, which wasn't part of their plan. And I have to tell you, what I'm about to say is deeply disturbing. But Harley told police that now, desperate, Sarah instructed Harley that she was going to have to dismember Adrienne's body. Harley flat out refused to do that. But it was already dark by that time anyway, so what they did was just conceal Adrienne's body with a bunch of branches and went back into town. Then, Harley said that on Sunday, January 23rd, Sarah drove them back to her grandparents' farm, where they smoked some pot before Harley said that Sarah dismembered Adrienne's body. And Harley explained that Sarah removed both Adrienne's arms and her head, and then placed them in a black trash bag. They then concealed the rest of Adrienne's remains on the farm. At this point, they headed back to East Mullen, and Harley said Sarah drove them to Black Hawk State Historical Site, which we're going to refer to as the Park, because that's how it's referred to by the locals. This is a 208-acre piece of land in Rock Island County that runs along the Rock River. Sarah led Harley down a hill where they found a covered manhole not too far from the water's edge. Sarah allegedly dumped the trash bags containing Adrienne's head and arms into that hole and covered it back up, placing leaves and sticks on top so it did not appear disturbed. Harley said that the reason she'd been so distressed and weak leading up to her confession was not because she was upset about what happened to poor Adrienne, but because, wait for it, she was worried about losing Sarah. Yes, that is correct. Losing Sarah. How can anyone have so much hold on another person? It is beyond me. According to Harley, Sarah was solely responsible for everything that happened, but I think most of us would probably beg to differ. But okay, with this new information from Harley, she agreed to take law enforcement to the park and show them where Adrienne's remains had been disposed of. Around 11 p.m. that Tuesday night, Harley guided officers, including Sergeant Shaquille, Detective Foles, and Sergeant Stein, down a wooded path to the manhole where she claimed Sarah had disposed of part of Adrienne's body. As Sergeant Steen and the other officers removed the manhole cover and looked inside with their flashlights, they caught sight of a black trash bag. Sergeant Stein was then lowered into the 8 to 10 foot deep manhole to retrieve the item. When he did, he could see what appeared to be a charred human hand protruding from the torn plastic. That is equally horrifying and heartbreaking, and of course, this officer would never forget the gruesome scene that confronted him. It was like something out of a horror movie, but this is real. This is a real person. This is real life. Inside the bag were Adrienne's head and her arms, just as Harley had told them. After midnight, other investigators were at Sarah's residence, and they searched the home and the garage. They seized a 24-inch long wooden handle with duct tape, a glass container, 2 handsaws, one that was 29 inches long and another that was 18 inches long, and a black jacket, gray pants, and a gray and black hoodie from Sarah's geoprism. They also took 4 lighters, a black leather belt, lint from inside the trunk, and on the passenger seat, there was a hair. In the glove compartment was a disposable camera, and fabric from the front seats was also taken to test for possible blood stains. By now, it was around 2 a.m. on Wednesday, January 26th, when Adrienne's parents, Tony and Joanne, got a knock at their front door. When they opened it up, they saw law enforcement standing on their doorstep and asking to come inside. That's when they knew the news was not going to be good. And my heart breaks for anyone who's had to receive news like this. The detectives at first sounded hopeful when they told Tony and Joanne that they'd found Adrienne in the park and were going to be making an arrest. But this makes me sad because the couple's world came crashing down just moments later. After a long pause, they learned that Adrienne was no longer alive. She had been found, but she was found dead. It was like everything was in slow motion. As horrifying as this was, according to Joanne, police didn't tell the couple that at that point their daughter had also been dismembered. I wish they would have, as hard as it would have been for them to hear that in the moment. Because the grieving parents were left to learn this detail from a press conference just hours later. Can you even imagine? It was terrible enough that Adrienne had been murdered, but to hear what happened to her afterward almost broke Tony and Joanne, as I'm sure it would do to anyone. Adrienne's birth mother, Carolyn, was just as shattered after hearing that she couldn't even bury Adrienne's complete body because not all of her remains had been found. Around 10:30 a.m., Harley then guided law enforcement, including crime scene investigators John Hatfield and Tom Murchie, to that ravine at Sarah's grandparents' farm. On the property, a blackened heap of ash was evident among the charred sticks, twigs, and melted pieces of the tarp. As sickening as it was, officers knew they were looking at the spot where Adrienne's body had been burned. This is what was left of that poor girl. 2 halves of her torso and a right leg were recovered from the ravine, along with some badly burned pieces of clothing, including pieces of an orange fabric. We know that Adrienne was wearing an orange hoodie. Sadly, there were even signs of animal activity already evident on Adrienne's remains, and her left leg couldn't be located at the time. But her left foot was eventually recovered. Police believed animals had actually carried her leg away. At this point, Sarah's geoprism was seized, and that afternoon, Wednesday, January 26th, she was arrested for Adrienne's murder. But she wasn't talking. While Adrienne's remains were sent off for an autopsy, which was conducted the very next day on Thursday, January 27th, Sergeant Shaquille and his team continued intensively interviewing everyone in Adrienne, Sarah, and Harley's lives. The day after Harley's confession and Adrienne's remains were found, a student from Black Hawk came forward. Her name was Lisa, and she wanted to tell the school principal about a disturbing conversation she had with Sarah back on Friday, January 21st. She said that Sarah had calmly asked her if you could kill someone by hitting them in the back of the head, and without emotion, Sarah then added that she was going to take this girl to a farm, beat her with a stick, and basically send her to an early grave so that no one would ever see her again. I can't believe Lisa did not report this, but sometimes it may seem like it's just a threat or a thought or a sick joke. And remember, Sarah looked dangerous. Recall, people said that she did this often, and she was all talk. By now, Harley had also been arrested that very same day. And remember Sarah's boyfriend, Sean? While he gave investigators his account of what happened on the day of the murder, he said that once the group had parked at Taco Bell, Sarah had asked Adrienne for a hug. Adrienne, so compassionate and kind as she was, went in for that hug, expecting to reconcile with Sarah. Instead, Sarah grabbed Adrienne's hair and began yelling at her. Adrienne was crying, and that's when Sean asked Sarah to stop. She snapped back at him that if he didn't like it, he could get out. Sean felt like there was going to be a fight, and he didn't want to be there, so he claimed he got out of the vehicle and walked to school. Later that evening, Sean said that he called Sarah, but she didn't want to talk to him. Then, the very next day, Sarah came to his house and told him she wanted to break up because she had lost all respect for him. Apparently, she found out that he told a neighbor about her argument at Taco Bell with Adrienne. That neighbor actually came forward and passed that information to the police. Sean took a polygraph and was eliminated as a suspect in this investigation. Then, one of Sarah's co-workers came forward, and they said they spoke to her the day after the murder. She was jumpy and nervous. Sarah actually told this co-worker that she got into a fight with another girl the previous day inside her car and asked if law enforcement would be allowed to search her vehicle. At this point, the co-worker responded that if police couldn't find the girl but found evidence in Sarah's car, she was screwed. That's when Sarah explained details of this fight, saying that she knocked the girl's teeth out and then choked her, causing her to spit out blood, and that Harley finished it. I honestly feel like at this point she was bragging. This co-worker had no idea who Sarah was referring to because she never used this girl's name. But I want to switch gears and talk about something unique to Black Hawk's English curriculum. Every student was required to keep a journal, which was turned in to the school at the end of each day. Law enforcement pored over the journals of those close to Adrienne, looking for any clue to guide them in a particular direction. They were finally able to read Sarah's journal after one of her friends, Tansy Jensen, turned it over. Now, another friend had given it to Tansy, and that other friend was told by Sarah to dispose of it, but she never did. And it's a good thing, because inside, the investigators found things that revealed an insight into Sarah's psyche. There was a stylized sketch featuring the words hate, kill, destroy in all caps. In one entry, prior to meeting Adrienne, Sarah had written that people didn't keep journals for themselves. They kept journals for other people. She said that the only safe place for your thoughts is in your memory. Then, another entry she wrote that she needed a vacation so she wouldn't hurt anyone or herself. Sarah's journal revealed her plans of asking Adrienne out for lunch, but Sarah had no intention of smoothing things over. In Sarah's entry from Friday, January 21st, the day that Adrienne went missing, Sarah had written about a girl who she was calling Jiffy, and we know who she gave that nickname to. She proceeded to call her a stupid and said the girl needed to back off of Sarah's Kool-Aid. It seems like Sarah really likes to use slang words, ones that I actually haven't heard before, used the way she used them. But Kool-Aid referred to Harley and Sean, apparently. The entry concluded by saying that she was going to effing kill this girl in question. I think we've seen enough to know exactly what happened. But I want to go back to the autopsy, because Adrienne's remains were dismembered and severely charred. It was nearly impossible for the forensic pathologist Dr. Jessica Bowman to determine the exact cause of her death. At the autopsy, pieces of the blue tarp had fused to Adrienne's head from the intense heat of the fire. She still had her earrings on and a bracelet on her right wrist. However, she was missing a necklace that she always wore, and it was later revealed that Sarah had actually stolen it. This was an incredibly challenging autopsy. You're dealing with charred remains, but Adrienne's internal organs and some of her bones were still visible due to the extreme heat. Her hand muscles had contracted, leaving her hands in a claw-like position, and 90% of her skin looked like charcoal. But the pathologist was able to determine that Adrienne had sustained 2 blows to the head prior to her death. However, neither of these blows was severe enough to be fatal. The exact cause of death was undetermined, but it was likely caused due to strangulation or smothering. By the time Adrienne's remains had been set on fire, she was already dead, and there were no indications of drugs or alcohol in her system, according to her toxicology report. On Sunday, January 30th, a week since Adrienne went missing, over 400 people, including Adrienne's family, friends, and her co-workers, attended her memorial service. The guitar that Adrienne received for Christmas, along with its broken string, was on display among all the flowers and posters plastered with Adrienne's pictures. People in attendance were wearing pink ribbons in Adrienne's honor. Meanwhile, there's more to tell you because this case gets even more convoluted. Someone else came forward to the police with possibly incriminating and highly disturbing evidence. A woman named Pat Corbin had a really weird feeling in the days following Adrienne's disappearance. She wondered if her 16-year-old grandson, Nathan Godet, knew more than he was letting on. He also had a troubled background and a history of drug use. Nathan had moved in with Pat after he was evicted from where he was living. His parents were also divorced, and although they were still in his life, he chose to go live with his grandmother. Now, Nathan didn't know Adrienne very well, but he had been good friends with Sarah for about the past 2 years. He met her through Harley, and they had gone to school together. Pat recalled that on Sunday, January 23rd, Sarah and Harley actually picked Nathan up, and they'd gone somewhere, but she had no idea where. However, she knew Nathan was wearing a backpack. Well, that night when he came back, Pat noticed that Nathan was sobbing uncontrollably in his room, and she just couldn't shake off this nagging feeling that something was wrong. So, on Wednesday, January 26th, after Sarah had been arrested, Pat went down to the basement and found Nathan's backpack. Inside was her husband's hacksaw, and that's when Pat called the police. They arranged to interview her grandson Nathan, who denied ever being with Sarah and Harley on the day of the murder. He told investigators he'd seen Sarah that evening when they hung out with some other friends, but she hadn't mentioned anything. Nathan stated that on the afternoon of January 22nd, Sarah had called him. She asked Nathan what he would do if he killed someone, as in, how would he dispose of the body? Then she told him flat out that she and Harley had killed Adrienne and asked Nathan to help them get rid of her remains. Now Sarah knew Nathan not only had a strong stomach, but also had a fascination with gore. He was known to be a sadistic person who liked to kill small animals and then chop them up. Nathan stated that he didn't really believe Sarah and Harley at first. It sounded too crazy to be true. But then he realized they were not kidding, they were absolutely serious. Nathan told the investigators that Sarah was open about the fact that she invited Adrienne to lunch as part of a plan to get her to go with her so she could kill her. To Nathan, it seemed like Sarah had orchestrated the whole plan, but Harley had participated equally in the actual murder. Sarah was the one who told Nathan to dismember Adrienne's body. Nathan said he felt like he was more involved now and was unable to back out, so he agreed. In his mind, he said he wanted to help Sarah and Harley stay out of jail. But I'm sitting here thinking it's probably impossible to justify that reasoning, considering he already knew what Sarah and Harley had done. And again, I don't know how Sarah had so much influence on other people. It's actually scary. It's like these people were under a spell. Nathan told Sergeant Shakili that on Sunday, January 23rd, Sarah and Harley picked him up, and he had his grandfather's hacksaw with him at the time in his backpack. The group then drove to the farm, where Nathan proceeded with the unimaginably sickening task of dismembering poor Adrienne's remains. He said he removed her legs, which had partially detached in the fire, her arms, and her head, and then he sawed her torso in half horizontally. Afterward, Harley placed the head and arms inside a black trash bag. Then Nathan said they took the trash bag with them into Sarah's car and drove to McDonald's for lunch. So they had a little bite to eat after what they did. It's unconscionable. Before driving to the park, where Harley disposed of the bag in the manhole, Sarah instructed him to clean the hacksaw and take it back to his grandparents' basement. The investigators were shocked that now a third teen had come forward admitting to being involved in such a heinous act. On January 31st, Nathan was charged with concealment of homicide, but because he cooperated and volunteered the information that he did, it was a juvenile charge. The next day, February 1st, Sarah and Harley were both charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in addition to concealment of a homicide. They both pleaded not guilty and were held on a $1 million bond to be tried separately as adults. Another memorial service was held for Adrienne, this time on February 5th in Longview, Texas, where she had previously lived with her biological mom, Carolyn. The couple joined 200 people attending the service at Emmanuel Baptist Church. Carolyn wore a pink sweater, Adrienne's favorite color, and she featured a photo button with a picture of Adrienne on it. At the front of the church was a pink flower arrangement on an altar, surrounding a picture of Adrienne in a pink photo frame. There were 2 pink candles, a pink teddy bear, and a slideshow playing, showing happier times in Adrienne's short life, accompanied by the song Friends by Christian artist Michael W. Smith. Adrienne's best friend from Texas, Carlin, spoke during the memorial, and she embraced Carolyn as they both fought back tears. Carolyn then thanked everyone for coming, and Adrienne was cremated. Her ashes were divided between Tony and Carolyn in Illinois. Her ashes were scattered at the Mullen Riverside Cemetery next to Tony's sister, who passed away 40 years earlier at just 5.5 weeks old. The remainder of her ashes were sent to Texas, where Carolyn had them buried in an unmarked grave. By now, Adrienne's DNA was found on the hacksaw, and on February 23rd, Nathan pleaded guilty to concealing the homicide. At his sentencing on March 30th, he apologized for his role in disposing of Adrienne's body. But for the Reynolds family and the judge, it wasn't enough. Nathan knew where Adrienne was the whole time while her family was worried, and he chose not to do the right thing and come forward to relieve their suffering. Judge McLean ultimately sentenced Nathan to a juvenile penalty of 5 years. Law enforcement continued their investigation and gathered more evidence in preparation for Sarah and Harley's upcoming trials. At this point, a local man named Glenn Roach, who had been having lunch at Taco Bell, came forward. He told police it was Friday, January 21st, and as he was leaving the restaurant, he noticed a red vehicle in the parking lot, rocking back and forth with a number of people inside. He thought someone inside was being beaten up, but because the windows were fogged up, he felt like it might be a couple of kids fooling around, so he didn't do anything. Sarah's grandmother also came forward. She said that on January 21st, it was her birthday, and that afternoon, while she was working at the Treasure Hunt antique store, Sarah and Harley came into the store around 4. Mary thought her granddaughter was there to wish her a happy birthday, but then she noticed that Sarah was quiet and fidgety. Sarah's aunt, Della, was also there at the time and noticed a scratch on Sarah's face. It was fresh. She asked her how she got it, and Sarah explained that she and Harley had been wrestling. We know that's not true. Sarah's sister, Elizabeth, also told police that in the hours following the murder, she helped Sarah hide a few things: a gardening tool, a shovel, and Adrienne's necklace. But of course, at the time, Elizabeth didn't know it was Adrienne's necklace. She didn't know Adrienne was missing or anything that had happened. She had no idea that these items were used in the murder. With all of this happening, the community of East Mullen was reeling. Things like this did not happen in their community. Adrienne's friends, as well as those within Sarah, Harley, and Nathan's circles, were shocked. They were in disbelief about what they were hearing. It was just too extreme to even contemplate it being true. Students who heard Sarah making threats in relation to Adrienne thought she was just all talk, only joking. But many of them felt that Harley could have stopped what was happening and chose not to. This was exactly what I mentioned earlier. Even if Harley had no idea about what was going to unfold in that car, she had the choice to stop Sarah from attacking Adrienne. But instead, she turned on her friend and played a role in this murder. No one could understand how something like this could happen, let alone be committed by two teenagers. It led many people to wonder who Sarah and Harley were underneath it all. So I want to take a moment to tell you a little bit about Sarah. Maybe this will provide some insight. Sarah Ann Kolb was born on April 23, 1988. She had grown up in East Moline and spent her childhood on her grandparents' farm. Her father, Tom, was actually a police officer, but Sarah's parents divorced when she was only 8 years old, and the family was living in Idaho at the time. Sarah didn't have much contact with her dad after her mom moved them to Illinois, and she didn't really get along with her mom either. She originally attended Rock Island High School, but due to anger issues and behavioral problems, alcohol and drug abuse, she was enrolled at Blackhawk in December 2003. She managed to stay out of trouble with the law, having only a traffic citation by the time of her arrest. And we know when Adrienne arrived, Sarah took an instant interest in the new girl. But apparently, Sarah's friends knew that her intentions were not pure. Sarah liked being a leader. She wanted to mold Adrienne into someone who followed her around and did whatever she wanted, kind of like a cult leader. By this time, Harley was also on the scene. Harley was born on November 2, 1986. Her parents also divorced when she was only 8 years old, and she and her younger brother mainly lived with their dad. Harley had a history of marijuana, cocaine, and ecstasy abuse and began drinking alcohol at just 14 years old. She never had any behavioral or academic issues, and she loved playing sports, but she really struggled socially. Then she began hanging out with Sarah. Harley's mom, Teresa, noticed a change in her personality. Harley became withdrawn from her friends and family, and Teresa really felt that Sarah was a bad influence, very controlling. Harley seemed totally obsessed with Sarah and was very happy to just follow her around, no matter how toxic the dynamic was. But now, let's jump back to the trial. While the death penalty no longer exists in Illinois, it was in place back in 2005. Even though both Sarah and Harley were being tried as adults, the prosecution announced they wouldn't be pursuing the death penalty because the killers were minors when the murder occurred. But if they were convicted, they would be sentenced to up to 60 years in prison. 17-year-old Sarah's trial got underway on October 31, 2005, at the Rock Island County Courthouse before Judge James Taros. Now the prosecution theory of the case. Let's go there. They believed that on January 21st, despite all the bad blood between them, Adrienne couldn't believe it when Sarah reached out to her and asked her to go to lunch. Adrienne was excited. She hoped the girls could call a truce and put everything behind them. But when they arrived at that Taco Bell parking lot, things changed. Sarah then started accusing Adrienne of being promiscuous, and then she and Harley both attacked Adrienne, together with one of them striking her in the head with a stick. The young girl was choked to death before Sarah and Harley drove out to Sarah's grandparents' farm, where they attempted to dispose of her body by setting it on fire. Sarah and Harley didn't realize that it's not like what you see on TV or in the movies. A human body doesn't just disintegrate. They didn't think they were going to get caught, but that's when they realized they were in over their heads. When it came to a motive, prosecutors argued that Sarah was angry about Adrienne's possible romantic interest in her boyfriend, Sean, as well as hooking up with those other boys and her friendship with Harley. They said that Sarah was consumed by jealousy and annoyed by Adrienne's constant pleading to be friends. Sarah was also furious that she was no longer at the top of the popularity pyramid at school, so she decided she was going to teach Adrienne a lesson. Not only that, but she also wanted to send a strong message to Harley about who really ran things in their friendship, which is why she invited Harley along. In the car, there was nothing to suggest that Sarah ever had any form of mental impairment. Harley didn't testify against Sarah, but Nathan did. He was the prosecution's star witness. Even though the defense challenged his integrity, claiming that he was lying in order to secure a plea deal, the defense's case? Are you ready for this? I'm going to tell you what they argued. They said that Sarah was completely blameless and innocent, and that Harley had been responsible for the entire thing. Wow. It's like they didn't even try to work on a defense. All they did was completely flip Harley's narrative. The defense argued that it was Sarah who was afraid of Harley, not the other way around. The defense called 5 witnesses, including Sarah's family, friends, and other people who spoke on her behalf. They testified that Sarah was the one who had been bullied, that she was a supportive friend, a good student, and that she suffered from being treated badly by her peers and her family. She also had a very difficult relationship with her mother, so they're totally placing her in the victim's role. And guess what? It's not a surprise to me. Sarah also took the stand in her own defense. She testified that on January 21st, she picked up Harley and her boyfriend Sean and drove to school. When they arrived, it was then that she started hearing rumors that she was going to beat up Adrienne. She later said she heard Adrienne wanted to be with her boyfriend Sean, so she admitted to feeling pretty angry, and that's why she wrote in her journal that she wanted to kill Adrienne. This sounds really, far-fetched. Maybe Sarah then told the court that she extended the lunch invitation to Adrienne because Adrienne approached her crying, saying she had no friends. Sarah said she still didn't like Adrienne, but she felt bad for her, so she had her come along. Sarah laid out her version of what happened next. She said that in the car, she confronted Adrienne over pursuing Sean and being intimate with other boys, and she grabbed Adrienne's hair, telling her to stay away from them. But Sarah claimed she backed off when Adrienne curled up in the fetal position and started crying. Sarah said it was Harley who started choking Adrienne from behind, without warning, forcing her into the back seat. Sarah testified that Adrienne was unable to escape from Harley, who had her across her lap, beating her with a stick and pressing it up against her throat. According to Sarah's version, she told Harley to stop, and that's when Harley struck her in the face with that stick and broke her nose. Harley was hysterical. The next thing Sarah knew, Harley told her that Adrienne was dead, and she testified that she saw Harley wrap her belt around Adrienne's neck to make sure she was dead and then covered her with a coat. Sarah testified that she was in shock at what happened and she denied strangling Adrienne. Sarah told the court the following: Harley's instructions, that's why she did everything else. She drove back home, didn't speak about anything because she just saw someone kill someone. Later, she said that Harley apparently instructed Sarah to drive out to her grandparents' farm, and that's where Harley wrapped Adrienne's body in a tarp, doused her with gasoline, and set her on fire. Sarah said she couldn't even bear to watch, but Harley was threatening to kill her, her family, and her cats if she told anyone. She claimed that dismembering Adrienne's body was all Harley's idea. Isn't this convenient? That everything is someone else's idea? On cross-examination, Sarah told the court that the witnesses who testified against her were all wrong and had fabricated their evidence. So essentially, everyone's lying except for Sarah. And during her time on the stand, this girl had an air of defiance about her. She was openly so rude and she responded to questions with more questions. It's like she wanted to run the show, and the trial was her stage. The jury retired to deliberate after 15 hours. There was an outcome, but no verdict. It was a hung jury on all charges. 11 jurors thought Sarah was guilty, but the foreman was holding out. This lone juror didn't feel that Sarah wasn't responsible, but they just weren't convinced that the state had proven she was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. On November 16th, a mistrial was declared, and this was devastating to all of Adrienne's loved ones. Now they had to sit through this all over again. That is a major setback. On February 6, 2006, Sarah's second trial began, and this time it was 60 miles away. They got a venue change due to the extensive media coverage. This time, the prosecution went with a little bit of a different argument, because maybe they were worried about proving that she murdered Adrienne beyond a reasonable doubt. They told the court that even though Sarah may not have actually killed Adrienne, she was responsible as the orchestrator. She initiated the confrontation in the car and escalated the situation by beating and choking Adrienne before Harley, in Sarah's words, finished her off again. Nathan testified for the prosecution, but unlike her first trial, Sarah decided not to take the stand. It was probably a good thing, and the defense rested without calling even one witness this time around. When it came to jury deliberations, the process was much smoother. It only took 10 hours, and they reached a verdict. On February 22nd, Sarah was found guilty on all charges, and I agree with that verdict. Harley's trial had also been moved for publicity reasons, but instead of it even happening, on April 27th, she pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and concealment of a homicidal death. She got a plea deal, and this was made because they believed that had Harley not confessed, there was a strong possibility that Adrienne's remains would have never been found. Instead of the 60-year maximum sentence permitted under the law, the state agreed to seek a maximum of only 40 years for the murder. Harley was ultimately sentenced to 40 years for the murder conviction, and then an extra 5 years for concealment, so there was a total of 45 years behind bars, which was the maximum. The court determined that Harley did have a long history of drug use and it had led to generally impaired judgment. She also had no prior criminal record. They took that into account, and she did demonstrate genuine remorse. Despite Harley's apology, she actually later denied killing Adrienne, claiming all she did was loosely hold the belt up after Adrienne was dead, and Sarah placed it around Adrienne's neck. Before I wrap up, let's get back to Sarah for one moment, because she was next to learn her fate at the sentencing. 7 weeks later, on August 29th, Tony and Joanne gave very moving victim impact statements. Joanne spoke of how she was still unable to sleep or enjoy anything in her life anymore. Joan couldn't stop thinking about the horror that Adrienne had experienced. In Joanne's eyes, Sarah had given the death penalty to someone who only wanted to be her friend. Tony told the court how Adrienne's life had started to turn around when she got to East Moline. For the first time in a long time, Adrienne seemed happy. Tony never let an opportunity go by for him to tell his daughter how much he loved her, and he said her smile made him feel complete. For Tony, Sarah had taken everything away from him, and her punishment should be no less than the maximum. Then it was Sarah's turn to address the court. She expressed remorse, but she never admitted to the murder. She said she was so good at not feeling anything in her life that she felt nothing as Adrienne died. Judge Taros told Sarah that she didn't care about anything following the murder. All she cared about was covering her tracks. She was cold and callous and was never going to change. In the end, Sarah received 48 years imprisonment with 3 years of mandatory supervised release on a first-degree murder charge, plus 5 years for the concealment of a homicidal death. This was to be served consecutively, totaling 53 years in prison. Of course, Sarah filed a motion for her sentence to be reconsidered, but it was denied, and I'm glad. This wasn't the last time she tried to appeal and do all kinds of things. None of them worked. Luckily, in the wake of Adrienne's death, Tony and Joanne established a memorial fund in her name because they wanted to raise awareness within schools and families to implement PR programs and initiatives to prevent teenagers from bullying each other and committing violence. I want to tell you something that happened in the aftermath of all this. On April 16th, 2012, then 23-year-old Nathan died in a single-vehicle car crash in Indiana, along with 2 other people. His Chevy had been traveling along South Victor Pike in Monroe County when the driver lost control and struck a tree. It's very tragic, but you know what? I'm sure some people would say it also could be karma. I'll let you decide. Today, 36-year-old Sarah continues to reside at the Logan Correctional Center in Illinois. And according to prison records, by the time she becomes eligible for parole, it will be 2053, and she will be 64 years old. Harley is also 36 years old and resides at Pontiac Correctional Center in Illinois. She will become eligible for parole in 2047 at the age of 59. Adrienne is the one who truly matters and the one who tragically is no longer with us because Sarah was too insecure and jealous to deal with rejection. She wanted to have power over people, and she felt like if she couldn't control them, she had to get rid of them. But another reason that Adrienne is no longer here is because the one person who we know could have intervened to save her, Harley, made a different choice, a cowardly choice that took the path of least resistance. I don't want Adrienne to be remembered for what Sarah, Harley, and Nathan did to her. That's not what Adrienne's memory means to so many people who loved her, including her family, and especially Tony and Joanne. They stepped up. They provided her a safe and loving home. Adrienne was headed in the right direction. She had her whole life ahead of her. For someone who had already overcome so much in her short life and was putting in the hard work to get back on track, this makes Adrienne's loss even more senseless. Her spirited personality, her eagerness to make friends and connect with people on a genuine level, and the determination to make something of herself are the traits I want you to remember her for, and what her loved ones will never forget. Tony keeps a photo of his daughter in his vintage Mustang, a 1966 model that replaced the car that Adrienne loved so much. Her spirit also lives on in Tony's poetry. In closing, I'd like you to stay and listen to Tony's words in a poem that he wrote to remember his daughter. You played the hand you were dealt. Even though it wasn't good, you held on to it and did the best you could. You were dealt to be my daughter, I was dealt to be your dad. No matter how the game turned out, you're the best hand I ever had.